Chapter 348. The world was big, but not as big as the monarch. When a monarch was not present, the teacher was great. When the teacher was far away, the gentleman was the greatest. The so-called gentleman was not the opposite of a petty person. Rather, it was a proper son of the monarch. In other words, the third prince, who was still a petty person, was the greatest in Suzhou, so Sir Chanley was not worried. After pretending to be distressed for a moment, he finally agreed to the prince's request. The third prince fiercely ordered the old nannies and eunuchs who had just hurried over from the palace to stay in the manor. He casually brought Sir Chanley and a few guards out of the manor. Seeing the young master disappear through the door, the eunuchs and nannies all trembled in fear. They thought that the commissioner was not here, and the world was about to turn upside down. They couldn't resist silently praying for the commissioner to hurry back. They had no idea that Fan Xian was going to use the third prince's identity to suppress them. It was rare for the third prince to have such an opportunity to have fun, so he was not in a hurry. The group of people changed clothes and pretended to be rich young masters on a trip. Sir Chanley fearfully was given the role of the older brother. Naturally, the third prince was the younger brother. Sitting in the carriage, they circled around Suzhou and saw some good scenery. They also gathered on the lake to look at a few pleasure boats. The third prince's interest finally weakened. The weather is too cold, and the girls are wearing too much. How can I see the romance? The noble young master furrowed his brows. Let's go pick a good place first. I have to put in a lot of effort for the business that Fan Xian wants to do. Otherwise, if I say you're taking me around blindly, I'm afraid he'll be angry. Sir Chanley thought to himself that it should have been like this a long time ago. The problem of choosing a location was easy to solve. In any case, it was the busiest place in Suzhou. The group of people desperately dove in and found the busiest street. They looked around and found that many brothels had opened. It was already a developed and familiar place. Thus, they decided on a general direction. Then, in this large area, they picked the clearest building to look at. They looked at the most imposing one. This group of people easily found their target. It was a restaurant that took up the best position on the street. It was an extravagant 3-story building. The building was wide, and behind it, one could faintly see the walls of the courtyard. It took up a lot of space. The third prince waved his hand and said, "Stop looking. I think this is the best location." Sir Chanley's heart was filled with joy. He had been managing the Baiwa brothel in the capital for a while now. But he never thought that picking a location for a store with a prince would be as efficient as this. With money and power, he did things efficiently and efficiently. But as he stood at the entrance of the restaurant, he thought of something and said in a low voice, "This place is too eye-catching. I think there must be someone behind it." The third prince was taken aback and asked, "Who in this world has a more powerful background than my family?" Sir Chanley opened his mouth wide and didn't say anything for a while. He forcefully swallowed the mouthful of blood and carefully said, "What if there are people from the governor's manor or the inspector's family? Although your highness doesn't care much, you still have to give these officials some face." Although the third prince was young, he was not a muddle-headed person. He thought that this was indeed the case. Governor Xueqing was not someone he could easily offend. Besides, his group of people had come thousands of li from Jingdou. If they wanted to steal the face of the Jiangnan officials, it would probably not look good. But he looked at the location of the restaurant. The more he looked, the more his heart itched. The more he looked, the more beautiful it seemed. He furrowed his thin brows and thought for a while. He then said, "We still have to ask. If we let go of this place with good feng shui, even if Fan Xian doesn't feel bad about it, I will feel bad for many days." This group of people had already stood outside the restaurant for a while. Just by looking at the layout, they blocked the entrance of the restaurant. They didn't eat and only sniffed. Although Suzhou was mixed with all sorts of people, there was no such thing. The group of people pointed and whispered at the entrance of the restaurant. They immediately attracted the attention of the people on the street. However, seeing the other party's bright clothing and powerful guards, they did not look like Jianghu figures. Thus, the merchants on the street restrained their gossiping hearts. Only the shopkeeper of the restaurant had no choice but to walk out. Piling on a professional smile, he asked, Everyone, would you like to come in and try our signature dishes? Our Bamboo Garden Restaurant and Jiangnan Restaurant are known as the second floor of Suzhou. We do indeed have some pretty good food. He saw that the people in front of the building seemed to be foreigners, and their statuses should not be ordinary, so he responded carefully. This Bamboo Garden Restaurant had its own background, but businessmen naturally had a clever heart. He only talked about business, and his words did not have the slightest intention of blaming the other party for blocking the entrance of the building. Sir Chanley was surprised. He smiled warmly and said, "I am truly sorry. I was distracted for a moment. Please don't blame me, shopkeeper." The shopkeeper quickly said, "You are too polite." The third prince was impatient to take things so slowly and said, "Let's go in and sit and talk." He led the group of people into the restaurant. At the end, he threw out a few words, "Shopkeeper, arrange for a quiet room. There are some things I would like to ask for advice on." The shopkeeper was surprised. He thought, "Your elder brother hasn't said anything yet. Why did I speak first?" Sir Chanley coughed a few times to cover it up and followed him into the restaurant. The group had yet to sit down in a room in the restaurant when the shopkeeper personally came in to greet them. The third prince didn't waste words and asked straightforwardly, "Shopkeeper, are you selling this restaurant or not?" The shopkeeper was quite surprised today. He thought to himself that this young master's tone was not small at all. However, he had dealt with many difficult matters in this life. He smiled humbly and said, "Young master, the business of this restaurant is quite good. The owner doesn't seem to have any intention of turning the tables." "May I ask for the owner's name?" Sir Chanley was secretly angry at the prince's impatience and changed the subject to ask warmly. The shopkeeper replied neither humbly nor overbearingly, "The owner's surname is Qian." After the shopkeeper left, Sir Chanley furrowed his brows and said, "This is my first time in Suzhou. I have no idea what the relationship is, and I don't know who the Qian person is." The third prince stood up and pushed open the window in the room. His expression couldn't help but freeze as if he had seen something strange. Sir Chanley was suspicious and walked behind him to look out the window. For a moment, he couldn't help but freeze where he was. Outside the window was the back garden of Zhiyuan Restaurant. In the garden was a flat lake. Although the surface of the lake was not wide, it was quiet and secluded. There were courtyard walls on both sides that separated it from the busy market. The grass in the courtyard was not green, but one could imagine the beautiful scenery of spring. It really is like the two of them opened their mouths and sighed at the same time. The "like" here was, of course, referring to the setup of the back of the building that was very similar to the setup of Baoyue Brothel in Jingdou, particularly on the grass. If a few quiet and secluded courtyards were built, they would probably become twins with Baoyue Brothel in Jingdou. Looking at the back garden of Zhiyuan Restaurant, the two managers of Baoyue Brothel were both moved. They had to buy this building. Buy it. The third prince and Sir Chanley spoke at the same time with great tacit understanding. They then chuckled. The rest of the matter was simple. After they returned, they would think of a way to find out the background of this Zhiyuan Restaurant. They could only hope that the other party's background was not too powerful. If it involved high-ranking officials, the matter would be more troublesome. The third prince was young, but it was unknown where he got all these size from. If Fan Sijia was here, I'm afraid he would have to fight a lawsuit with the owner of this restaurant. He would point at their nose and scold them for shamelessly copying their design. Sir Chanley thought about it. Second young master Fan was indeed like this. He couldn't help but burst into laughter. "What are you laughing at?" The third prince glared at him. "My second cousin is even more sinister than my eldest cousin. Of course, neither of them are kind people. They forcefully played the trick of a cicada shedding its carapace. They bullied me because I was young and stole my shares. Don't forget, you also had a part in this." Sir Chanley shrank back and did not dare to reply. The group of them had a meal in the private room and were very impressed with the culinary skills of this restaurant. The third prince even had the thought of hiring the original chef over. After the meal, just as everyone was preparing to leave, they saw the shopkeeper hurriedly walk into the private room. With a face full of sweat, he bowed again. As he wiped away his sweat, he said in a gentle voice, "Dear guests, earlier we talked about buying the building. Could we discuss it again? The third prince and his group were very strange. This restaurant's business was clearly very good. Furthermore, when they had asked earlier, the other party had clearly been on guard. Why had their attitude suddenly changed so much? Sir Chanley probingly asked, "Shopkeeper, what do you mean?" The shopkeeper laughed dryly and said, "Earlier, the owner heard of this matter and thought that business has not been as good as in previous years. Since there were honored guests who made a bid, they simply let it out. They only hope that the honored guests can give a suitable price. Also, they hope that after the sale, the honored guests can take good care of this building." Sir Chanley became more and more curious. He was just about to ask something when the third prince said with a smile, "Of course, we are also people who do business. Of course, we will take good care of this building. However, you said a suitable price earlier. What kind of price would be suitable?" The private room immediately fell silent. The shopkeeper's eyes froze. He thought to himself, how dare he ask this young master to make a bid just like that? But the owner didn't have any orders. How could he make a bid? Looking at the owner's intentions, he was certainly planning on giving it away with both hands. But the other party didn't seem to notice. Was he going to make a bid himself? The sweat on his forehead seeped faster and faster. His face was red and swollen. It was as if the chilly early spring weather had turned into the middle of the summer. After holding it in for a while, the shopkeeper finally gathered his courage and extended 4 fingers. Sir Chanley paused. The guard in the room paused again. They thought to themselves, 40,000 liang. No matter how famous the lion's head of this place was, it shouldn't be so exorbitant. The shopkeeper saw that the other party didn't respond and felt even more afraid. He quickly pulled back 3 fingers, leaving only his index finger standing pitifully. Sir Chanley almost spat out blood again. This price was really strange. He didn't need to say anything, and in the blink of an eye, it had gone from 40,000 liang to 10,000 liang. After thinking about it, he felt that this price was actually not bad. He nodded and said, "Although 10,000 liang of silver is not much," but the shopkeeper's legs went soft, and he almost cried. "Mister, you're wrong, you're wrong." Sir Chanley asked in surprise, "How is it wrong?" "It is 1,000 liang." The shopkeeper forced out an innocent smile. "Not 10,000 liang." Sir Chanley swallowed back his 3rd mouthful of blood today. Before he had time to say anything, the third prince had already said, "Bring the contract." Looking at his expression, it seemed that he had a card up his sleeve. The shopkeeper seemed to have long been prepared. He immediately went out to invite a person recognized by the government to enter and began to write the contract. When he wrote down the amount of the transaction, the third prince smiled sweetly and said, 16,000 liang. "I won't take advantage of you. I'll give you an extra 20% of the silver. Presumably, your owner won't be willing to sell, so count this 20% as buying medicine for him." Although the third prince was wearing commoner's clothing today, he naturally exuded a noble aura. Although the shopkeeper was greatly surprised, he did not dare to say anything. After writing the contract, the 2 parties pressed their fingerprints and agreed to settle the transaction tomorrow. Carefully seeing this group of people out of the restaurant, the shopkeeper let out a breath and wiped the cold sweat off his forehead with some fear. After calming his mind, he walked to the 3rd floor and entered a quiet room. He handed the contract in his pocket to a young man. This young man's face was clear and upright, and his eyes were warm and spirited. It was the young master of the Ming family who had appeared at the Westlake restaurant in Hangzhou, Ming Lansher. He accepted the contract and glanced at it. A glimmer of hatred and disappointment flashed through his eyes. With the back of his hand, he slapped the shopkeeper across the face. With a slap, the shopkeeper covered his face and looked fearfully at the young master. He didn't know what he had done wrong. Useless thing. Ming Lansher was angry in his heart, but his expression remained warm. A chill seeped through his words. "Even if I wanted you to give me money, you wouldn't be able to." After the family meeting, Ming Lansher had stayed in Suzhou. Suddenly, he heard the shopkeeper say that someone wanted to buy the restaurant. Hearing the other person's description and attire, this successor of the Ming family vaguely guessed something. When a waiter later overheard the name Fan Xijia, he immediately confirmed the other person's identity. He reacted quickly and prepared to hand over the bamboo garden restaurant with both hands. Unexpectedly, the other person did not take any advantage at all. 16,000 liang of silver was not a small amount. Not only did this amount not take advantage of the Ming family, on the contrary, it was much higher than the market price. But how could the Ming family lack this little bit of money? Ming Launcher wanted to take advantage of the fact that the third prince did not know who the owner of the bamboo garden restaurant was to be the first to give this restaurant away, even if it was sold cheaply. His main goal was, of course, to curry favor with the other party. If the other party did not acknowledge this small favor in the future, sending this contract to Jingdo would be proof that Fan Xian and the third prince were using their power to forcefully buy private property. In the future, it would be a good reason for the eldest princess to sue the emperor. Who would have thought that the young third prince would not be willing to take advantage of this? Were the rumors in Jingdo false? Was this prince not as greedy and ruthless as the rumors said? Ming Launcher sank into deep thought. He once again realized that the people the family was going to face this time were truly difficult to grasp. He closed his eyes and thought for a moment. In a quiet voice, he ordered, "Sir Fan's thoughts are very simple. He wants to open a brothel. Send down the order. No brothel is allowed to sell girls to them, no matter how high the price." The shopkeeper made a sound of acknowledgement and immediately smiled bitterly. "Young master, it's only our own girls that are not for sale. There are many people in this business in Suzhou. Those people would certainly not want to offend Sir Fan. Do they have good girls in their hands?" Ming Launcher smiled slightly. "The good girls are all in our Yuan master's hands. Let them go buy them. How can leftovers attract customers?" A carriage left the bamboo garden restaurant. The surrounding merchants did not know that the Ming family had suffered a loss. This most famous restaurant in Suzhou was going to change hands tomorrow. Although Sir Chomley rarely did such shady things, he had finally come to his senses. Furrowing his brows, he said, "Your Highness, it looks like they know your identity." A glimmer of annoyance flashed across the third prince's childish face. "At least they are smart." Sir Chomley thought for a bit and couldn't resist opening his mouth to ask, "Your Highness, the price they offered earlier was 1,000 liang. Why do I have to raise the price myself?" The third prince smiled coldly. "Those who are unaccountably solicitous are hiding evil intentions. After guessing my identity, they wish they could offer up this restaurant with both hands. What about in the future?" "I'm afraid what they are asking for is not as simple as this restaurant. If they put on a smiling face, of course, it would not be good for us to slap them in the face, but there is also no need to put our faces up to be intimate with them. How many people in this world have the right to make friends with me?" Sir Chomley shook his head and said, "I wonder who the owner behind that restaurant is. They sure see the opportunity quickly." The third prince said, "Who cares who they are? If they want me to take advantage of them, they must be someone who wants to take advantage of me. You have to remember this. In the future, when you go out, don't randomly take advantage of others. Be careful of bringing trouble for Fan Xian." Sir Chomley admired the little prince in front of him from the bottom of his heart. He sighed in admiration and said, "Your Highness's words are simple, but they are very deep." The third prince scolded in a clear and childish voice, "Don't flatter me. It's not easy for me to pretend to be a commoner, and now I've been seen through. I don't feel good about it." Sir Chomley thought to himself, "You want to buy the restaurant as soon as you enter at such a young age. Is this the tone you should use to hide your identity?" He also thought that the prince in front of him was so young, yet he was able to resist not taking advantage of tens of thousands of liang of silver. It seemed to be a far cry from the sinister personality he had when he was in Baiwa brothel. A glimmer of doubt involuntarily flashed through his eyes. He didn't know if the third prince saw his expression, but he continued, "Fan Xian once said, 'Whenever I take advantage of the people of this world, in the end, the people of this world will take advantage of the court, and if the court is taken advantage of by others, then I am an idiot who is willing to take out my own silver for others to spend." Sir Chomley was silent. He was secretly worried for his teacher. As a prince, he had established this kind of thinking. Naturally, it was telling this prince that the interests of the court would be his own interests in the future. What did this mean? The crown prince was still on the throne. Not noticing the fear in Sher Chanli's heart, the third prince smiled shyly and said, "Teacher once said that a gentleman loves money and takes it in a proper way. The wealth of a ruler is hidden under the heavens. Why take it?" Sher Chanli swallowed back the fourth mouthful of blood from his hidden injury. His eyes stared at the green banner that floated endlessly outside the carriage window. Forcefully suppressing the hidden fear in his heart, he pretended he hadn't heard these words. Doing business can be seen as a hobby, the third prince chuckled. The third prince chuckled and said, "Old Sher, your courage is much smaller than that of my two cousins. You are not made for doing business." Sher Chanli shifted his body to let the slightly damp clothes on his back breathe in. Smiling bitterly, he replied, "Your Highness is right." The third prince called for the carriage to stop and said, "We have arrived at the money house. You go to your work. I will return to the manor first." A sinister smile rose to the child's face. No one knew what he was proud of. Watching the carriage leave into the distance, Sher Chanli quietly let out a breath and called for the two guards following him to wait outside. He tidied up his clothes slightly and walked toward a branch of Taiping Money House. Not far behind him was the Zhaoshang Money House that had just opened a few months ago. Although the entrance was cold and deserted, it exuded an aura of nobility. The brand new green banner seemed to be mocking Sher Chanli's pedantry and ignorance. "Chicken has two yolks. Eat half first." Putting aside what new and surprising things Sher Chanli would encounter in the money house, outside the jurisdiction of the Palace Treasury Transport Company far away from Suzhou, there was a massive group of carriages carrying over 100 people. It was currently moving forward with difficulty in the dark and cold rain of early spring. The Palace Treasury Transport Company was different from the salt and tea companies. First of all, they had more work to do and their profits were greater. Furthermore, they were the only one of the three that had actual land. The Palace Treasury produced all kinds of factories and workshops, which required a large amount of land. Ever since the court carved out a piece of land in North Min many years ago, it had gradually become a special region. Its area was larger than a small province, and its position was very special, because they were worried that the Palace Treasury's manufacturing techniques would flow out of the country. The Qing court had put in a lot of effort in the work of protecting the Palace Treasury. For the territory the Palace Treasury governed, the Qing kingdom carried out a completely sealed management. They had set up a total of 5 blockade lines. The outermost line was the local Jiangnan Army and Navy. The inner 4 lines were each set by the Qing military and the Overwatch Council. They monitored each other like a multi-layered fruit cake. As for the transportation lines going out, other than the strict supervision on the surface, there were countless spies planted in them. Countless eyes, whether in the light or in the dark, were watching the Chui family, the Ming family, or some other giant agent merchant. Even though the Qing kingdom had spent so much power, it still could not stop the greedy gazes of other countries. During these decades, countless things had happened to the Palace Treasury, and the Qing kingdom had paid a heavy price for it. First, it had to spend a great deal of silver each year to station troops and defend. Secondly, during these decades, for the sake of the Qing kingdom's prosperity, thousands of lives had been lost. The battle of stealing intelligence and anti-commercial espionage was particularly bloody in this world. It seemed that this battle would never end. The Overwatch Council was the organization that had paid the greatest price in this battle. No one knew how many spies had died in the dark. Fortunately, it ensured that the Palace Treasury was still safe up to this day. The previous head of the 4th Bureau, Yin Ruohai, and the current head of the Jingdo Garrison, Qin Heng's brother, Qin Shan, were the people in charge of setting up the defenses. The two of them had once boasted that other than being unable to do anything to a great grandmaster, not even a mosquito that had been stained with perfume could fly out of the Palace Treasury's defenses. The group of carriages was undergoing the last inspection. Fan Xian lifted the curtain and looked at the hydraulic machinery by the river not far away. His eyes narrowed slightly. Although it was just some initial and crude industry, The need for power could not be separated from water. A chill appeared in his narrowed eyes. He didn't turn around. Warmly, he said, "I brought you in for my own safety. I don't want you to go into the various workshops to watch the excitement. If you're discovered, you should know how serious the consequences are. Even if you are a superior ninth-level ace, you may not be able to escape the pursuit of the power here. Furthermore, although my injuries are only half healed, I will still personally act." Behind him, Haitang, disguised as a serving girl, smiled slightly and glanced at Cece beside her. She didn't say anything. "Want a monthly ticket? Want a monthly ticket? Want a monthly ticket? Want a monthly ticket P." Chapter 349. Fan Xian's gaze leaped over the green trees by the side of the road, the endless fields behind the trees, and the flowing river not far away. He moved further and further, as if he wanted to see through everything here. Finally, his gaze landed lightly on the large workshop where the river flowed to. There was smoke rising into the air, but it was not the faint green smoke of a farmhouse. Rather, it was black smoke with a familiar smell. Was it a blast furnace? The commoners of this large area had all been recruited by the court to work in the palace treasury. The wages were much higher than growing grain, so there was less interest in taking care of the fields. In a large fertile field, weeds and first rice struggled to grow. It looked somewhat messy. Fan Xian took a deep breath and smelled the fresh scent in the air. He relaxed. It seemed that the environmental pollution here was not as bad as he had thought. Of course, further away in the Tongshan mine, the environment was certainly much worse than here. Looking at the scene in front of him, it seemed that a feeling that had left him for many years gradually returned to his mind. However, that feeling was still gentle and not turbulent. It made him feel somewhat lost. Last September, he had always felt that there was something deep in his heart that he longed for, but he had never been able to find it. Seeing that he was lost in thought, Haitang's hands were in her sleeves like an old man's. She furrowed her brows and looked at the handsome face by the window. She also sank into deep thought. What did this young and powerful official want to do? "How do you feel?" She saw that Fan Xian's mood was not at peace today and asked with a smile. Fan Xian said quietly, "I should be the one asking you that." Haidang smiled. "It is indeed a rare sight. I had never thought that the Qing Kingdom's palace treasury would be so large. I couldn't even name the things I saw earlier." Fan Xian replied, "Look at it. I don't think you'll be able to go back and make one." A strange light appeared in Haitang's eyes. She smiled and asked, "You have that much confidence in the palace treasury?" Fan Xian was slightly startled. He then quietly replied, "It's not that I have confidence in the palace treasury. It's just that these things should not have appeared in this world. If you can learn to make them just by looking at the outside, then there's something fishy." She seemed to have thought of something and fell silent. After a while, she said, "The people in the palace treasury are all trusted aides of Xinjiang. How do you plan on taking over?" Fan Xian raised his eyebrows, and a faint smile appeared on his face. "No matter whose people they are, they're all mine now." Haidang glanced at him suspiciously. "Do you really intend to fight to the death with him?" Fan Xian fell silent. A moment later, he said in a heavy voice, "This question of yours seems to have come a little too late." Haidang furrowed her brows. "I believe that your mother-in-law isn't a foolish person. She can't see the current situation clearly. Logically speaking, both you and her have the desire to renegotiate and live together. Moreover, with benefits at hand, it seems that neither side wants to see you and her shed all pretense of cordiality. If I don't shed all pretense of cordiality with her, I think you and the Northern Qi Emperor won't be willing to see it." Fan Xian smiled mockingly and said, "Relax, I won't join forces with my mother-in-law again to bully the orphans and widows in the north." Haidang was silent. She didn't know if she believed him or not. Fan Xian wasn't worried about Northern Qi's attitude. After all, as long as the palace treasury existed, the Northern Qi people would have to rely on him. As for what Haidang said earlier, it wasn't without reason. In the eyes of the important figures who played politics, any hatred from the past could be cast aside in the face of a large enough bargaining chip. This was especially true when Fan Xian and the eldest princess had one her acting as a lubricant between them. In the eyes of the common people, as long as the eldest princess was willing to make concessions, Fan Xian had no reason not to accept the peace talks. In reality, the eldest princess had already made concessions. After the assassination in Song Mountain, the most beautiful lady in the kingdom of Qing had truly felt Fan Xian's great power. She had written a number of letters and tried in this direction. It was just that Fan Xian hadn't accepted it. Calm your heart. Fan Xian didn't withdraw his gaze from outside the carriage. He said quietly, "The eldest princess is already willing to accept the fact that I control the palace treasury, but I don't care." Haiding suddenly raised her head. Her bright eyes stared at Fan Xian's back. She didn't know why he would refuse Xinyan's compromise. Fan Xian explained quietly, "She wants a 30% share, so she can cooperate with me to easily take over the palace treasury. This condition isn't harsh." Haiding furrowed her brows. After a moment of silence, she said, "Not only is it not harsh, it can already be considered a very sincere condition. Originally, from the standpoint of the Qi court, the more you and the eldest princess get into conflict, the better it is for us. But from a standpoint of a friend, I want to give you a piece of advice. When all is said and done, your power was given to you by the Qing royal family. After all, she is your mother-in-law. There is no reason not to accept such a good condition." Fan Xian laughed self-mockingly. "Is that so? I don't think so. Perhaps it is from my very bones that I believe that in the matter of the palace treasury, I will not allow anyone to fight with me." "Why?" Haiding still couldn't figure out what he was thinking. "This is the business my mother left behind." Fan Xian smiled warmly. "I don't have her ability, so I can only be his second-generation ancestor. But I can't ruin this family." The carriage fell silent. After a long time, Haitang said quietly, "But the present palace treasury still belongs to the Qing court." "The court is nothing more than an illusory image," Fan Xian said. "What is the court? The emperor? The officials? The empress dowager? Or the common people?" He finally said, "The key is to see what kind of use the palace treasury will have in my hands and what the silver can be used for. If the court does not use it well, then I will use it on behalf of the court. I will turn this illusory image into the real words of the common people." Haidang smiled slightly and said, "You're used to playing the role of a saint again." Fan Xian smiled and replied, "I told Yin Bingyan before that occasionally playing the role of a saint is a very beneficial supplement to one's spiritual world." After bringing out the secret negotiations he had with the eldest princess and giving Haidang a peace of mind, Fan Xian once again fell silent. He looked at the scenery outside the carriage in a daze. The water wheels by the river, the sound of some kind of mechanism in the workshop, and the black smoke rising from the furnaces in the distance were all urging the unknown desire in his heart. "Sir, we've arrived." The humble voice of the Palace Treasury Transport Company official roused Fan Xian from his thoughts. He looked with confusion at the two women in the carriage. Only now did he know that the Palace Treasury Transport Company had arrived. He quickly tidied his clothes, lifted the curtain, and jumped out. He jumped out and did not maintain the bearing that an official should have by slowly and steadily walking down. Just this action displayed the strange nervousness and excitement in Fan Xian's heart. After all, he had finally arrived at the palace treasury, the place where his mother had made her fortune. How could he still maintain his usual calm? His feet landed on the hard ground. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and examined everything around him. He found that by the side of the street was a normal yamen. It was not at all the bustling scene of the great leap forward that he had imagined. The street was rather quiet. Although the buildings around him were new and beautiful, it did not seem like a construction site. Perhaps the transport company official responsible for welcoming him from Suzhou had seen this kind of attitude from Jingdou officials many times and carefully explained, "The 3 workshops are still far from the yamen. Sir, please rest today. Tomorrow, you can go down to inspect." Fan Xian was a bit disappointed. He had planned to go blow glass, weave cotton, and shake hands with the workers today. He didn't think he would have to wait another day. The yamen's doors were all open. The Palace Treasury Transport Company, as well as the officials of the Overwatch Council responsible for security, split into two lines to welcome the Imperial envoy's arrival. Fan Xian walked in first. Gauda brought a few tiger guards and followed silently behind him. A group of 100 or so people had been settled down in a short amount of time. It looked like the Palace Treasury's operations were still very fast. Haidang and Cece were brought to the back residence. In addition to the new servant girls they had bought on the way, the previously quiet manner of the transport company immediately became lively. After the officials paid their respects to Fan Xian, everyone took their places in the yamen and waited for Fan Xian to speak. Fan Xian was not very familiar with the situation in the palace treasury. Furthermore, this was the first time he had opened a yamen, so he felt it was strange. He indicated for Su Wenmao to represent him and say a few useless words. He then had everyone disperse and wait for the yamen to officially open the next day. After returning to the back residence, he didn't have time to familiarize himself with his own official residence. At the first instant, he summoned the Overwatch Council's resident commander of the palace treasury. This official was about 40 years old and had a head of white hair. It looked like the palace treasury security work was truly exhausting. He indicated for him to sit and didn't waste words. Very straightforwardly, he asked, "Tell me the situation." This Overwatch Council official was under the jurisdiction of the 4th Bureau. Since last autumn, he had already received the Yin father and son's secret letter and had long made preparations. Seeing Fan Xian's questions, he quickly dug out everything he knew. Of course, he understood that Commissioner Fan had just come to the palace treasury and did not have many trusted aides. If he wanted to quickly take control of the situation, then he had to find someone trustworthy in the treasury. As an official of the Overwatch Council, he was in a favorable position. Naturally, he had to quickly climb up in order to not waste the opportunity heaven had given him. Fan Xian listened and nodded his head repeatedly. This Overwatch Council official's words and actions were very nimble. In their conversation, he had clearly explained the current situation of the palace treasury. The duties of the 3 workshops and the factions of the various treasurers were all left out. Why has the palace treasury lost so much these years? Fan Xian was born daring. He asked this kind of question openly, not caring at all that it was inconvenient for the Overwatch Council official in front of him to speak. The Overwatch Council official's name was Danda. In front of Fan Xian, he didn't dare be too daring. How could a lower-level official like him explain the palace treasury's matters in a few words? However, he still said after some deliberation, "Actually, it can't be considered a loss. It's just that the taxes sent to Jingdo have indeed decreased by a few %." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and helplessly. For an old hen that gives birth to a golden chicken to earn less and less each year, what's the difference between that and a loss? I don't know how the previous one managed it. The previous head of the Palace Treasury Transport Company was the cousin of the eldest princess chief strategist, Huang Yi, in Xinyang's Li Palace, Sir Huang Wanshu. When Fan Xian took over the palace treasury, he did not meet with this Sir Huang. The two sides were like fire and water, so he was too lazy to go through the formalities of taking over. They were both single people. Danda didn't follow up on his words to belittle the eldest princess. Sincerely, he said, "The reason the profits have decreased year after year is because the 3 workshops' expenses are increasing. Including the masters of the workshops, the treasurers take too much. Secondly, there have been some problems with the export channels. The pirates on the sea are too rampant. I don't dare to say too much, but at least 1 or 2 out of 10 halts are lost on the sea. Thirdly, there's the problem of supplies to northern Qi. A few years ago, the accounts were too messy. I don't know how much the Chui family took with them, but no one dared to investigate this matter. Fortunately, the commissioner made a move and investigated the Chui family before the year. Just this alone could save the court a lot of losses." Fan Xian listened with interest, but he knew very well in his heart that what pirates? It was all a trick of the Ming family, stealing their own goods. He looked at Danda, wanting to say something, but then hesitating. He asked curiously, "What other reasons are there?" Danda glanced at him and smiled bitterly. "Also, The council's expenses have increased too quickly these years. As you know, the majority of the council's expenses come directly from the palace treasury. The palace's expenses haven't increased much these years. On the contrary, it's the council that spends too much. Adding on the things I mentioned earlier, with this cut, no matter how much the palace treasury can earn money for the court, it's no longer as grand as it was in the past. Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath. He had not thought that the Overwatch Council was also one of the palace treasury's vampires. Thinking about it, the brothers of the Third Bureau researched weapons of mass destruction every day, and the crows of the Second Bureau searched all over the world for information. No matter how they disguised it, they would always need financial support. Not to mention the Fifth and Sixth Bureau, these two black hole yamens that had no construction and only knew how to destroy and suck in money. Of course, even if these council matters didn't count, he had played in Chun Garden many times. That old cripple had raised so many beautiful women and lived a luxurious life comparable to that of an emperor. He shook his head and smiled bitterly. Let's not talk about the council's matters for now. If it gets out, it'll be embarrassing. Just investigate those routes. Danda and Su Wenmao, who was behind Fan Xian, couldn't resist laughing. They thought to themselves that the commissioner spoke very directly. I'll take care of the problem of the distribution channels and the problem of the pirates. Fan Xian stared into Danda's eyes. 2 out of the 4 evils have been removed. I just don't understand how the treasures of the 3 large workshops can be mentioned in the same breath as these abuses. Those officials stay in Jiangnan for a long time and are not allowed to leave without permission. It is indeed hard work. It is right that the court gives them a generous salary. Danda didn't dare meet his eyes. He lowered his head and said, the 3 large workshops are responsible for all production in the palace treasury. Those goods were all made by them, so what? Fan Xian smiled coldly. Do they dare to use this to threaten me? Naturally, they don't dare to threaten me, Danda replied with a bitter smile. But the court's management of the palace treasury is strict. All the processes, ingredients, and recipes are only known to the upper, middle, and lower levels of the treasurers. The things in their heads are like the court's silver production machines. As long as they use a bit of cunning, they can reduce the output of the palace treasury. Thus, their positions in the palace treasury have always been special. The court also looks at them differently, so much so that they're somewhat arrogant. Oh, Fan Xian narrowed his eyes in amusement. He thought to himself, even those little helpers from the Yi family had now become technocrats who monopolized and became rich? If this isn't threatening, then what is? Fan Xian increasingly felt that this matter was absurd and funny. He chuckled and said, then, how did the eldest princess deal with these treasurers in the beginning? Danda thought for a bit and furrowed his brows. The eldest princess only wanted the output not to drop. She basically did her best to satisfy the requests of the treasurers. She also raised their positions very high. Of course, if there were any treasurers who didn't know their limits, the eldest princess would have her methods. 6 years ago, she killed 7 treasurers who caused trouble in one go. From then on, the treasurers learned to silently make a fortune. They don't have a good attitude toward us officials of the same level, but they still don't have any disrespect toward the court. Fan Xian smiled coldly. Arrogant? A very high position. Then the first thing I can do is knock them into the dust. He was a bit angry in his heart. His mother-in-law was indeed not made to be a manager. She had managed such a large enterprise to such a state. No wonder the emperor complained every day, and his father also had headaches about the empty national treasury. Danda jumped in fright. He thought to himself that the commissioner was still young. If a new official took on new responsibilities and calmed his anger with lightning, he would truly offend all of the treasurers. Putting aside the palace treasury's distribution channels, it would probably be difficult to guarantee their own output and the quality of their goods. He raised his hands in a salute and said in a low voice, Sir, please think carefully. There is no harm in responding to them with a soft heart and then slowly planning. I can't plan slowly. 10,000 years is too long. I have to seize every moment. In 10 days, I have to return to Suzhou to preside over the opening of the palace treasury to welcome the bids. If I don't beat the dissatisfied people in the palace treasury into submission in these 10 days, how will you manage things in the future? I don't have the interest to come to this place every day. Danda said with a pained expression. This matter is not easy to deal with. Even if we beat the treasurers into submission on the surface, they will secretly do something in the workshop. They don't even need to do anything to lower the palace treasury's output. If we investigate, we won't be able to find anything. In the end, I'm afraid this responsibility will still have to be shouldered by you. Fan Xian somewhat admired this person's straightforward attitude. The atmosphere of the Overwatch Council officials was indeed much better than that of the Jiangnan Road officials. He waved his hand to stop the other party's admonition and smiled. Don't be afraid. After killing Butcher Zhang, do we have to eat furred pigs? Danda and Su and Mao paused. They didn't know where the commissioner got his confidence from. The treasurers were in charge of production. This was not something the Overwatch Council was good at. Suddenly, Su and Mao's mind moved. He remembered that the palace treasury had once been the property of the Yi family, and he was a descendant of the Yi family. Did the commissioner have his own way? Fan Xian didn't explain anything. He only had them prepare for the true opening of the yamen tomorrow. He himself went to the rear courtyard and ate 2 bowls of porridge unhappily. He then sincerely invited Haidang to walk with him to the 3 large workshops at night. A subordinate had already helped him get a pass. Even if he didn't reveal his identity at night, there shouldn't be any problems. The reason he had called Haidang to go with him was not because he was kind and wanted to extend the glory of the palace treasury to Northern Qi. It was purely because he needed a powerful bodyguard like Haidang. The rooster crowed, and the sky turned white. A shadow floated by the back wall of the Palace Treasury Transport Company's manor. Fan Xian and Haidang had finished a night of exploration and returned to the study. Fan Xian's face was heavy. He furrowed his brows and said, singing every night, "Corrupt management." Are these 2 words? Haidang was still immersed in shock. Tonight, she had followed Fan Xian around the 3 large workshops. Although she hadn't come into contact with the military or anything like that, she was still shocked by what she had seen and heard. So, cotton was made using that kind of spinning machine. Furthermore, it didn't use human power, but water power. How could the power of a river be so tamed? Thinking back to what she had seen and heard tonight, she felt even more admiration for the mistress of the Yi family, who had long disappeared in the long river of history. Her gaze toward Fan Xian also burned a little hotter. Wasn't Fan Xian the son of the mistress of the Yi family? Fan Xian was not as shocked as she was. His initial sense of novelty had worn off. Although he still felt the joy of admiring his mother's legacy, the treasury of the Qing kingdom was probably not even as good as the village enterprises of his previous life. It was just some very basic things. If it were not for the Qing emperor's intelligence and how he kept a close eye on all the industries, they would probably not be as valuable as they were in the past. However, it was just shunned, and they couldn't even produce refrigerators. How could Fan Xian be surprised? What he was surprised about was another matter. The treasurers of the palace treasury indeed lived extravagantly. His heart couldn't help but itch. If he swallowed the silver these people ate into his stomach, how much money would that be? As for the things that the eldest princess was worried about, he was not too worried. What bullsh** T technical monopoly? It wasn't a particularly difficult way to survive. Although he had not come from science background, blowing a few glasses was not too much of a problem. Most importantly, he had people behind him. Knowledge was power. Knowledge was confidence. Knowledge was silver. This was the powerful understanding Fan Xian had developed on his first day in the palace treasury. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 350. The Qing National Treasury Transport Company was the most famous independent kingdom within its borders. Although the officials were all sent from Jingdou because they were far away in Jiangnan, and there were too many temptations within, no matter what rank an official came from outside, In the end, they would all be assimilated by this enormous and alluring golden nest. Perhaps the officials of the Overwatch Council were better, but the officials within the transport company had long become one of the pillars of this independent kingdom. No one wanted any change to happen to the palace treasury. Even though the emperor had given an edict for the palace treasury to be transferred from the eldest princess of Xinjiang to Commissioner Fan. Although these palace treasury officials had been the eldest princess' trusted aides for over a dozen years, they were not afraid of Fan Xian's arrival. They thought that as long as they did their superficial work well, presumably Sir Fan Jr. would not touch the foundation of the palace treasury. The trick of changing the emperor and changing the court officials would not play out. What was the foundation of the palace treasury? It was not the mountains of gold and silver, not the laboring workers, not the merchants on the outside, but the high-level craftsmen and treasurers of the three large workshops. The three large workshops of the palace treasury were spread across the various provinces of Jiangnan. The first workshop was responsible for producing glass products, handicrafts that required high precision, porcelain goods, extremely expensive perfume, famous spirits that had been steamed over and over again, and many more. Things like glass products could be expanded into countless products. In short, they could be called luxury goods producers. The second workshop was responsible for producing large amounts of cotton cloth, gauze, researching rice seeds, forging good steel, and major production. The combination of the first and second industries was mainly producing daily necessities. The third workshop was the most heavily guarded of the three workshops. It was responsible for producing ships and advanced military equipment that the military needed. For example, the lightweight repeating crossbows that the Black Knights were currently equipped with were provided by this workshop. Further away, the Third Bureau of the Overwatch Council and the Research Department of the Palace Treasury were still endlessly developing gunpowder. However, ever since the Yi family had opened the workshop, the development of gunpowder seemed to have gone down a wrong path. At present, the Overwatch Council could only use a card of gunpowder as cannon and had not invented firearms. No one knew if it was because the people of the Qin Kingdom were not smart enough or if that Yi woman had done something bad in the past. The three large workshops were just a rough description. There were countless related products scattered densely across North Min, producing goods endlessly. Then, they were picked up by private merchants and distributed to northern Qi, Dongyi, small vassal states, and wild kingdoms beyond the ocean. They greedily and violently seized the money and food of the entire world. At the same time, they spread a better quality of life and more luxurious enjoyment to the entire world. After the Yi family was taken into the palace treasury, although the various industries were greatly impacted, their legacy remained. Furthermore, the various levels of treasurers had brought out a great deal of wisdom to bring the Yi family's industries to greater heights. This curve reached its peak 17 years ago. Of the entire Qin Kingdom's financial income, 40% came from the palace treasury. It was only in recent years that this number had declined slightly. However, it was still the Qin Kingdom's largest source of financial income. To borrow a common phrase from a certain world, the palace treasury was the engine of desire that pushed the Qin Kingdom forward. It was precisely because the treasurers, an unranked official, had a very important effect on the palace treasury's production. Additionally, the eldest princess herself was a woman who traveled the world by scheming. She was not good at using a mountain-splitting knife to carry out management. Thus, over the years, all kinds of situations had overlapped and made the treasurers the most special group of officials in the Qin Kingdom. The lowest level of workers in the palace treasury did not earn much money. Even the officials responsible for management were not very arrogant. Only the treasurers, other than a generous salary, enjoyed all kinds of allowances and various bonuses. It had to be said that this was the result of the eldest princess raising wolves with high salaries. It also had to do with the chaotic management of the court these years. In the Palace Treasury Transport Company, the treasurers were truly like local tyrants. Although they did not appear arrogant on the surface, they secretly took money, exploited workers, and scattered the money they obtained through the money houses on the periphery into the wilderness. They had already taken up a lot of land in the surrounding provinces. As for how many shameful methods they had used, no one knew. Additionally, these treasurers in the palace treasury bullied the lower-level workers and took advantage of men and women. The higher-ranking treasurers paid attention to their face, but the middle-ranked 30-year-old treasurers were naked and shameless. One of the treasurers Fan Xian found in the middle of the night had 12 concubines at home. As for how those 20-year-old concubines came about, who could say? They only knew that every year there would be workers making trouble. As for those who complained, they could not be counted. However, the palace treasury was special. Often, the victims of these complaints could not leave the palace treasury. Even if they were lucky enough to make it to Suzhou, they would always be fooled by the court. Offending good people was a small matter, but offending the treasurers was a big matter. This was the consensus of the Jiangnan road officials. Thus, after the new head of the Palace Treasury Transport Company, the imperial envoy Fan Xian, arrived at the North Min Yamen, the lower-level workers and commoners who held a bone-deep hatred for the treasurers no longer beat the drums and cried out their grievances. Instead, they looked coldly at the door of the yamen. A glimmer of dark fire flashed through their eyes. The moment the fire appeared, the sound of firecrackers rang out, and red confetti filled the air. The front door of the North Min Palace Treasury Transport Company Yamen slowly opened. Dozens of officials dressed in formal robes filed in amidst the slightly smoky smell. They split into two rows and bowed respectfully to the young official in the middle. Fan Xian brought out the imperial edict, brought out the sword, showed his identity as the imperial envoy, and explained the rules of management. He looked at his subordinates below and pressed his hands together. "Sit. Thank you for the seat." The officials of the palace treasury tidied up their clothing and sat down. There were not enough seats in the yamen, so some of the lower-level officials stood at the back. Everyone looked at the warm smile on Sir Fan Jr.'s face and felt slightly reassured. Furthermore, they did not see the Overwatch Council's wolf-like Jingdo officials. Their slightly wary minds immediately relaxed. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked down. Very easily, he found his target among the crowd of officials. There were about 5 or 6 people. There were 3 people with dark complexions. They wore normal clothes with belts tied tightly around their waists. They sat there respectfully. It was clear that these 3 people did not have official positions, yet they sat among the crowd of officials. Furthermore, from their appearance, it was clear that they often went in and out of the workshops. It was a bit of an eyesore. Fan Xian's eyes were particularly sharp. He saw a glimmer of indifference and disdain toward him in their seemingly respectful and cautious manner. It was an expression of great confidence. He smiled slightly. Someone as calm and sinister as him would not be angered by the other party's expression. However, since the other party had been raised by the eldest princess for so many years, and he wanted to completely control the palace treasury, he had to knock them down a peg or two. He first put aside the 3 people and told the officials about the court's intentions. He then chatted a bit with the military representative sitting to his right. This military official was a distant relative of the Yi family. Although the Yi family seemed to have been forced to the second prince's side by the emperor, due to the existence of Yi Ling, the relationship between Fan Xian and the Yi family was still passable. Thus, the Yi family general was particularly respectful toward Fan Xian. Presumably, the family in the capital had given him some orders. After all the official matters had been said, Fan Xian suddenly quieted down. He raised his teacup and took a sip. The Qin kingdom did not have the custom of serving tea to send off guests. The officials knew that Sir Fan must have something important to say, so they all quieted down. Everyone already knew that Sir Fan Jr.'s inaugural speech in the bamboo sheds at the Suzhou docks beside the river had already shocked all of the Jiangnan road officials. They couldn't help but be curious about his words today. The palace treasury is truly a strange place, Fan Xian said with a smile. The officials also smiled along. The deputy added, "In the wilderness, there is only knocking and banging. Although it is annoying, it is different." Fan Xian also smiled. "I thought the reason it was strange was because on this trip south by imperial edict, Every time I opened the yamen and revealed my identity, there would always be a local victim who would beat the drum and cry out their grievances, saying that the local officials had done many illegal things. I didn't expect that after opening the yamen for half a day, in such a large place, there would not be a single commoner who would submit a petition. The officials paused and silently cursed. You've been stealthily heading south. What kind of grievances are there? But for Fan Xian to say this, there must be something else. They couldn't help but feel their hearts rise. Of course, Fan Xian's words were nonsense. It was just a prelude. I'm greatly gratified that under the governance of my colleagues, the palace treasury is clean and tidy. There is no illegal activity. It is truly rare. The officials' faces heated up. They repeatedly said they didn't dare to. Fan Xian's face did not darken. He only smiled and said, but there's another question. I don't know if there's truly nothing wrong with the palace treasury, or some officials have too much authority, so even if the commoners and workers have complaints in their hearts, they don't dare to say it to me. These words were too careless. It was an undisguised attempt to frame someone for a crime. Regardless of faction, the officials were all local officials of the palace treasury. Their hearts froze, and a glimmer of disgust grew in them. They thought, even if you want to burn 3 fires, you can't use such an absurd method. With the deputy in the lead, the officials all stepped out and said in a loud voice, Sir, there is no such thing. There is no such thing. Fan Xian lowered his head. His fingers gently rubbed the cuffs Cece had just sewn and asked, There is no such thing? I heard that these years, the 3 large workshops owe their workers a great deal of wages. Last year, there was even a major incident. Is there such a thing? The officials paused. Last year, because the treasurers had exploited them too harshly, the workers of the 3 large workshops had indeed caused a commotion and 2 people had died. This matter had long been hidden by the officials of the transport company. Unexpectedly, the news had traveled to Jingdo. Since Sir Fan had already said it, then he must have received accurate information. It would be difficult to hide it. The deputy quickly went forward and smiled apologetically. Before the year, the return of funds was a bit slow. The wages were only paid 3 days late. In the end, those unruly people took the opportunity to cause trouble and caused the 3 large workshops to stop work for a day. It brought irreparable damage to the court. Thus, after the transport company discussed it, we asked General Yi to suppress it. Fortunately, not too many lives were lost. Thinking that it was close to the end of the year and you would be arriving soon, there was no rush to report it. In reality, it was not that the wages had been paid late. More accurately, it was that the treasurers had taken too much of the wages they had given out. Under the accumulated anger, the public's anger gradually rose, and the workers began to make trouble. The officials of the transport company did not want to offend the treasurers, nor did they want to take out public silver to make up for the debt. Thus, they pretended to be deaf and dumb. Only when the matter grew did they mobilize troops to suppress it. Fan Xian turned around and quietly said a few words to General Yi. The general's face revealed an awkward expression and quietly responded. Presumably, the role he played in this matter was not honorable. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and gently knocked on the table beside him. Everyone, to put it bluntly, this palace treasury is a business. However, it is the emperor's business and the Qin court's business. Since it does business, then the most important thing is the people who do it. Year after year, delaying the workers' wages. Who would be willing to work for you? Even if they did work, how could they be willing to put their heart into it? In the end, isn't it still the court that loses out? The officials repeatedly voiced their agreement. They all said that in the future, they would strictly follow the rules of the palace treasury and that there would be no more delaying of wages. As for what would happen in the future, that was for the treasurers to deal with Sir Fan Jr. These officials only hoped to quickly deceive the scene in front of them. However, the expressions of the 3 dark-skinned figures sitting in the chairs without official robes became somewhat ugly. Just talking nonsense. Fan Xian shook his head and sighed. Naturally, we won't be delaying in the future. Then what about those we owed in the past? The main hall of the yamen immediately sank into a death-like silence. In their fear, the officials did not say anything more. There were tens of thousands of palace treasury workers, adding on food, lodging, water, clothing, and a series of other logistics. The number of people reached a terrifying level. The court set generous wages for the workers of the 3 workshops. Drawing water from them had become one of the biggest sources of wealth for the palace treasury officials. If Fanxian really wanted these officials to spit out all of the deductions from the past few years, it would be a large sum. These officials knew in their hearts that they were hindered by the Qing law and the Overwatch Council's investigation, so they never dared to eat openly. It was only a small gift from the treasurers after they had eaten. Sir Fan was probably targeting those treasurers. Thus, the gazes of the officials swept, intentionally or unintentionally, across the 3 of them. It was as if Fan Xian did not sense the turbulence in the dark. In an even voice, he said, "The court cannot owe its people. The debts from the past few years will have to be gradually made up. However, the matter is complicated and cannot be rushed." Cannot be rushed. The hearts of the officials once again relaxed, but they were greatly frightened by what he said next. 3 days. Fanxian smiled slightly and extended 3 fingers. Gazing at the officials, he said, "I give you all 3 days to fill in all of the debts for me. Make up all of the wages owed to the workers below. Remember, use the interest from Taiping Money House as the basis. After 3 days, if there are still workers who come to me and say they have not received their wages," Fanxian said, "or perhaps my subordinates in the Overwatch Council have found out. Sorry, everyone, I will have to show some ruthlessness." Although he was smiling, the officials could already feel a chill beginning to spread around them. The 3 brothers who had been sitting calmly finally could not sit still. With humble expressions, they stood up and said, "Sir, I have something to report." "Speak." Fanxian glanced at him with great interest. "There may be cases of delayed wages, but the amount is not large. Furthermore, it is often because the account are not going smoothly." The person chuckled. "Sir, you have come from far away in Jingdao. Perhaps you do not know how powerful the unruly people in these places are. Those people bring their families to work. It is clearly one person working in the workshop, but he has to report 3 people. It is not that we have delayed wages. It is that they want to swindle the court of silver." "Oh." Fanxian made a sound of surprise. "There is such a trick?" "Yes." The person clearly did not see the sarcasm in Fanxian's words. Overjoyed, he said, "Sir, those workers are sly and cunning. Relying on the fact that the court cares for the people, they dare to make exorbitant demands. If there are any demands that cannot be met, they will slack off. There are even worse fellows who dare to tamper with the process. These years, who knows how much silver the court has lost? This person poured dirty water on the workers. No matter how good Commissioner Fan's reputation was, he was still an official. How could he sit on the side of the workers? As the saying goes, one's position determines one's position. There was no need to worry about not standing on the side of the workers." Fanxian laughed coldly in his heart. These words pushed all of his frequent crimes onto the workers. But his expression was not happy. He sighed. "Ah, I did not expect the emperor to be so benevolent, and yet these people are still so unsatisfied." The person smiled apologetically. "It is indeed so. When I return, I will investigate the matter of delayed wages. But those workers who have caused trouble cannot be easily forgiven. Sir, do not be fooled by the words of these scoundrels. Those people are sly and cunning, and they are truly not good people." Fanxian looked at this person and suddenly furrowed his brows. "May I ask who you are?" At the side, the deputy quickly made an introduction. "This is the master of the first workshop, Sir Xiao." "Sir Xiao?" Fanxian seemed a little surprised. "Master of the first workshop? The head of the treasurers?" The master of the 3 workshops, surnamed Xiao, quickly bowed. "That is me." Fanxian stared at him for a moment and suddenly opened his mouth. "You are a mere master, nothing more than a little treasurer. The court has given you an unranked rank. You don't even have an official position. How dare you call yourself a lowly official in front of me? Everyone was startled. His voice suddenly became cold. You keep calling yourself a lowly official. What kind of official are you? This is the first time a yamen has opened its doors. You, a mere master, are not waiting outside to be summoned. Instead, you dare to barge into the hall and sit among the court officials. How dare you? Dare I ask, what kind of bastard and daring thing are you? The hall was silent for a long time. It was not until a long time later that the officials heard clearly that Sir Fan was cursing. Immediately, the hall exploded with a roar. How could this be? Ever since the palace treasury had been returned to the royal family, this was the first time someone had pointed at the faces of the masters of the three workshops and cursed. Even the eldest princess, who had come to the Northman Yamen for the first time after taking over the palace treasury, was very gentle toward the three masters of the three workshops. How could Sir Fan dare to curse them? The master of the first workshop, Sir Shao, was also stunned. He had not thought that, even if Sir Fan did not want to win him over, he would not give him face and curse him so fiercely. He gave a muffled grunt, and his expression immediately became ugly. However, facing a proper prince, he did not dare to say anything. He resentfully raised his hands in a salute and returned to his seat to be a quiet bodhisattva. Remove his seat. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and furrowed his brows into a beautiful little circle. In an even voice, he said, "There is no seat for him in front of me." Sir Fan. The master flew into a rage. Before his buttocks had even touched the seat, he straightened his body again. Forcefully suppressing the anger in his heart, he said, "Don't go too far." Fan Xian completely ignored this person. He drank his tea and chatted with the awkward-looking General Yi and the deputy beside him. As they spoke, the Overwatch Council officials beside him had already gone down. They pushed Sir Shao to the side and removed his seat. Thus, the matter became serious. Not only did the officials below all come out to plead for leniency, even General Yi lowered his voice and said by Fan Xian's ear, "Young Master Fan, leave them some face." Leave them some face? Fan Xian smiled and said, "Today, I have come especially to rip their faces off." General Yi was stupefied and didn't continue to speak. Ever since the opening of the palace treasury yamen, the masters of the three workshops all had their own seats in the yamen. Their positions were special, and no one had ever humiliated their existence like this. Seeing the master of the first workshop being humiliated, the other two masters of the third workshop could no longer sit still. They rose to stand beside Sir Shao and said to Fan Xian in a cold voice, "Since you think there is no place for us in the yamen, why don't we remove it together? In any case, the three workshops are nothing more than lowly people." They were not acting out of spite. They were using the three workshops to pressure others. Fan Xian raised his head and looked at the three masters standing in a row in front of him. He smiled slightly and said, "Of course, we will remove it together. Do you think there will still be a place for you? Of course, the three workshops are not all lowly people, but since you have all admitted it, I will believe you." "Sir." The masters of the three workshops had not expected Fan Xian to press forward step by step. His words did not leave any room for retreat. Only now did they know that he was not only trying to establish his might, he was trying to kill them all. But what confidence did Fan Xian have? Did he really want to see the three workshops collapse? The tone of the masters of the three workshops once again became ruthless. "Sir, how have the three workshops offended you?" Exploiting wages, bullying men and women, using skills to threaten the court, disrespecting me, of course. Fan Xian stared at the three of them and said, "You have not offended me. You have offended the workers in the three workshops, as well as the court and the people who support you. If you wish to incriminate someone, you can always find a pretext," the three masters said angrily. The three masters said angrily, "Sir, you had just come to the transport company, yet you act so recklessly. Does the Qing court really not have any rules?" "Rules? I'm the rules," Fan Xian thought with a smile. Of course, he didn't say these words out loud. He just remembered that when Second Fan had run amok in Jingdo, his favorite thing to say was these ruthless words. It looked like being an official was the same as being a thug. When encountering a chaotic situation where the situation was unclear, it was always possible to use some brutal techniques. These 3 people are making a ruckus in the hall. Drag them out and give them 10 strokes of the paddle first. Fan Xian gently placed the teacup in his hand on the table and ignored the pleading words of the officials below. He smiled and thought that he was suffering and tyrannical, but he was impatient. How could he waste his breath on these people? Chapter 351. Pa 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 pa. The sound was crisp. It was not like the muffled sound of the cane landing on the bodies of the imperial censorate outside the royal palace. Instead, it was like someone was beating the beat to a piece of music with a strong sense of rhythm. The beat only fell 10 times before it ended. In the end, the 3 workshop masters were not like Brother Baoyu, who breathed in but did not exhale, nor did they faint like Second Fan. Fan Xian watched the scene with great interest. He couldn't help but be surprised at the toughness of these 3 masters. After being beaten 10 times, they did not even make a sound. He was someone who knew his subordinate style. Since he had yelled for them to be beaten, not a single one dared to hold back. The 3 masters lay sprawled on the long bench. Their clothes had been lifted up and their pants had been pulled down. Their buttocks and backs were covered in red marks. They looked wretched, but they had suffered too much humiliation. In front of Fan Xian, they forced themselves not to make a sound for mercy. However, it was always painful to be beaten. Other than the pain, there was also a shred of humiliation from having their clothes ripped off. It made tears begin to well up in the eyes of these middle-aged men. They were watery and filled with hatred, like pitiful puppies. Fan Xian clapped his hands and said, "Strike them out." Yes, his subordinates replied in unison. They helped the 3 masters up and walked out of the yamen. Behind these 3 masters, who had long been humiliated beyond measure, Fan Xian did not forget to call out like a merchant. 3 days, 3 days, don't you forget. The yamen immediately quieted down. The gazes of the officials looking at Fan Xian grew a glimmer of fear. Everyone under heaven knew of Fan Xian's reputation, but they were not from Jingdou. These officials had not personally experienced the coldness hidden within Fan Xian's clean and scholarly reputation. They were not as clear of the pain as the civil officials the second prince had sent. But today, everyone finally saw it. Other than being secretly afraid, they also couldn't help but sneer. Beating him was fine. He was beating the treasurers, and it was for us officials to see. However, no matter how knowledgeable Sir Fan was, he was still completely ignorant of the affairs of the palace treasury. Now that he had offended the masters of the 3 large workshops, it would be interesting to see how he would clean up after this. Perhaps Fan Xian did not know that his subordinates and officials had the intention of watching a show 3 days later. Perhaps he did not care about this at all. He casually said a few more words and ordered everyone to pay back their debts within 3 days. If there was anything illegal, they were to investigate themselves. He then let the officials out of the yamen. He left behind the general from the Yi family and his close assistant, the vice commissioner of the transport division. In many ways, he still needed the help of these 2 people to do what he was going to do in 3 days. No one knew what he said to the 2 officials in the back garden, but their expressions grew heavier and heavier. In the end, they slowly nodded their heads, bowed respectfully to Fan Xian, and left. "Sir," Su Wenmao handed over the intelligence report the Overwatch Council had sent up. Fan Xian accepted it and nodded slightly as he read. It looked like the people of the 4th Bureau still had some use. However, these years, they had been suppressed by the eldest princess and the treasurers from top to bottom and hadn't had a chance to display their skills. Su Wenmao looked at him immersed in the file and thought of the scene earlier. He couldn't help but furrow his brows. Gathering his courage, he quietly said, "The masters of the 3 large workshops were killed." Fan Xian raised his head to glance at him and couldn't resist smiling. Of course they were killed. However, killing is not like cooking. If you can eat, you can eat. If you can kill, you don't have to be in a hurry to kill. Sir was too gentle earlier. Su Wenmao came from the 1st Bureau of the Overwatch Council. When it came to managing officials, he was always vicious and merciless. He truly felt that Fan Xian's earlier punishment had been too kind. It was merely 3 masters. If they were killed, then they were killed. Since they wanted to establish their might, then they had to strike like lightning. How could he speak for so long and only give them 10 beatings? He unhappily said, "Sir, you only gave them 10 beatings earlier. That was too light. I'm afraid it will make these people feel dissatisfied." Fan Xian waved the Overwatch Council intelligence report in his hand and calmly said, "Based on the evidence in my hand, if I chopped off those 3 heads with 1 stroke, no one would dare say anything." Su and Mao was startled. Since this was the case, why had the thunder and rain been small earlier and let go of those 3 people who had no law in their eyes? Fan Xian smiled and explained, "Thunder and rain, they're all grace. If I had punished them harshly earlier, although the officials and the treasurers would not be satisfied in their hearts and would even grow jealous out of fear, they could only agree. Furthermore, they would be intimidated by the sharpness of the executioner's knife and would become obedient. These 3 days, I'm afraid that in less than a day, the officials will all make up for the deficit. As for the treasurers, they will crazily send silver to the yamen. Isn't this the situation you want to see?" Su and Mao became more and more confused. Fan Xian waved his hand. "Wrong. Suppressing it for a while and only killing the masters of the 3 workshops, what fundamental change can there be for the palace treasury? It's like hunting monkeys in the mountains. If you kill the Monkey King, the monkeys will scatter in all directions. You also know that it is impossible for me to, and I do not want to, guard the palace treasury for a long time. What will happen in the future after we leave? Those monkeys will run out from the mountains again and steal our corn to eat." Su and Mao's heart jumped. He understood something. The monkeys the commissioner spoke of were the numerous treasurers of the 3 workshops. If he beheaded the masters of the 3 workshops, the treasurers would obediently spit out the silver and return the wages owed to the workers. However, in that case, the commissioner would lose the opportunity to strike again. In the future, when the commissioner left North Min and returned to Hangzhou, far away from Shannon Road, the treasurers would probably become active again. The workers of the 3 workshops would probably have to face even more tragic revenge. "This is squeezing out pus," Fan Xian said with a smile. "Your face looks flat, but the pus is still inside, so we don't rush to scrub first. Instead, we need to open up the pores and squeeze out all of the pus." Su and Mao was startled. It was clear he had never taken beauty classes, but he understood Fan Xian's meaning. He smiled and said, "The complicated you speak of, isn't it to lure the snake out of its hole?" "Lure what?" "This is called beating the snake to startle the snake." Fan Xian touched his smooth hair and found that his description was not very appropriate. He couldn't resist smiling and said, "In any case, in 3 days' time, the humiliation of the 3 workshops being flogged 10 times. Presumably, those arrogant and willful treasurers would not be able to endure it no matter what. What if someone makes up for the silver? What then?" Su Wenmao asked with confusion. He was worried that after the commissioner's reputation spread, those little monkeys would not have the courage to jump out. "Learn from past mistakes to avoid future mistakes. Cure the illness and save the patient," Fan Xian said seriously. Fan Xian said very seriously, "As long as the treasurers who have not violated the Qing law completely return the silver, I will naturally give them a chance to turn over a new leaf. I am here to manage the palace treasury, not to break it." "Understood. When it comes to enemies, we have to divide them, carry out order, treat them separately, and unite all that can be united. Let's see who jumps out in 3 days, and we'll know who is rejecting my good intentions." Fan Xian smiled slightly. "Not only are we targeting the treasurers, presumably, the trusted aides the eldest princess left in the palace treasury will not let go of such a great opportunity. From Xinyang's perspective, if I offend all the treasurers, the palace treasury will naturally sink into paralysis. At this time, they will certainly jump out. Have the people of the 4th Bureau keep a close eye on them for the next 2 days and finally draw up a list. I will ask these unstable elements to leave one by one." Sua Mao finally understood everything. The commissioner was going to do a thorough cleanup. He thought back to the conversation in the garden earlier and carefully said, "Only, sir, the deputy is someone from Ren Qian's clan, so he can be trusted. But the Yi family?" Fan Xian knew what he was worried about. According to the news from Jingdo, a few days after the Great Prince married the Great Princess of Northern Qi, Yi Linger finally married the second prince. The second prince had also used this opportunity to be released from his house arrest with the Empress Dowager's intervention. "Don't worry about anything. I didn't say too much. I just had General Yi pay attention to the routes out of the treasury. I'm not so arrogant as to think I can subdue the Yi family with just a few words." Fan Xian smiled. What he had General Yi do was actually to prevent the treasurers from taking advantage of their location and secretly moving out the silver they had swallowed these years. Although most of the stolen silver had been used to buy land, the property deeds, the temperament of the treasurers had determined that they could only be left in their own homes. Furthermore, don't casually connect the Yi family to the second prince and the eldest princess, Fan Xian said after thinking for a bit. The Yi and Qin families are known together in the world. They're not as simple as most people think. How could they one-sidedly lean toward one prince? That would be too stupid. Even if he leans before the situation is clear, he will still have to give me some face. To fall out with me for the sake of a group of treasurers, unless Yizhong truly resents the emperor for not sending him farther away. Sua Mao froze and didn't say anything more. He accepted his orders and left. Fan Xian sat in the chair and sank into silence. A moment later, he sighed. In the end, Yi Linger was married. What would the second prince's fate be in the future? He was not a kind person, but in the tea shop outside Baiwa Brothel, he had once said that the reason he had beaten the second prince into the dust was because he wanted to keep him alive. This was partly because of his relationship with Yi Linger. Another reason was that he subconsciously wanted to compete with the emperor, who was particular about raising his son, to see if he knew how to play or if he knew how to play. For many months, the Yi family had been played by the emperor. With no other choice, they could only get closer and closer to the second prince. Thinking of this, Fan Xian had a belly full of anger. Perhaps the emperor's deep planning and foresight was true, but as an emperor, his paranoia was even more true. It seemed that people sitting in different positions all had their own limitations. The emperor, sitting on the dragon chair, his limitation was that he was too paranoia. First, he used the bestowal of marriage to test the waters. Then, without reason, he gradually raised his guard and shamelessly framed the Yi family, forcing them to stand against the crown prince. The crown prince? Then why did the third prince follow him out of the capital? The emperor was truly not someone who ate porridge. He always played tricks that people couldn't see through. Fan Xian was a bit vexed. He immediately comforted himself that he, a little bastard, couldn't understand. Perhaps the old bastard was also messing things up, and he himself didn't understand. As for why Fan Xian was so determined not to reconcile with his mother-in-law, it was not because he had been bullied by his son-in-law during the course of their relationship. It was also not just because of the reason he had told Haidang to look after the family business. The most practical reason was that if Fan Xian and the eldest princess truly joined hands, the combined power of the two sides would reach a terrifying level. It would be enough to shake the foundations of the Qing kingdom. This was something the Qing emperor would definitely not allow. For Fan Xian, who did not have the power of the world in his hands, his current way of doing things was that great wisdom appeared stupid. As long as the emperor did not allow it, he would not do it unless someone wanted to kill him. In the next 2 days, the imperial envoy Fan Xian, who had just arrived in the palace treasury, brought his 7 serving girls and gorgeously inspected the workshops. He gradually became familiar with the process of the palace treasury and gained a deeper understanding of the Yi family's power. It was inevitable that he would touch the wood beside the water wheel by the river and sigh with an endless sense of vicissitudes. Occasionally, he would sit and discuss with the workers in the workshop about the art of blowing glass. It was a pity that his skills were too poor and his face was too beautiful. He could not blow successfully, but the texture of the glass was undoubtedly revealed. After 2 days, most of the workshops closer to the Yamen knew what the new official looked like. As for the legendary Sir Fan Jr., although they didn't dare to look at him directly, they still sneaked a few careful glances. They all said that this noble young master was very good-looking, but his hands and feet were a bit clumsy. His personality was also very kind. The 7 servant girls at his side were all as pretty as flowers and jade. However, one of the serving girls was not very pretty. Her way of doing things and walking had the style of country bumpkin. She did not look like a girl from a large family. On the other side, the 4 lines of defense formed by the military and the Overwatch Council suddenly tightened their patrolling work. The palace treasury's patrolling had always been the strictest place in the world. With the sudden tightening, they immediately found some forbidden items. Although they were not the secrets of the palace treasury's techniques, they were still heavy items. They were light pieces of paper, but they were heavy land deeds. As Fan Xian had expected, the first reaction of the treasurers and related officials, including the masters of the 3 large workshops, after the 3-day order came out, was to find a way to move the most valuable things on them out and give them to their friends and relatives outside the palace treasury. However, after encountering a strict search, the officials and treasurers finally lost all hope. They knew that the new imperial envoy would not allow them to move their property. If they kept the property on paper by their side, God, if they didn't make up for the deficit in 3 days, wouldn't their property be confiscated? Furthermore, how could these people be clean? If the imperial envoy wanted to find fault with them, death was the word left and right. Danda and General Lin's work was clearly effective. From his 2nd day onwards, no one tried to move their property. A cold wind began to blow between the manors of the palace treasury and the 3 large workshops. As for who the source of the wind was, naturally, there were spies sent out to quietly find out. It was night. Heavy rain fell from the sky in Min, and the river swelled. Although there were no problems because of the dam, the cold wind howling angrily and the turbid waves rising into the air had already begun to make many people feel strange. The treasurers, who felt a strong sense of danger, began to link up. From top to bottom, there were more than 200 treasurers. They all had their own plans in the face of the 3-day order. Some of them still had a conscience and were prepared to return the stolen money and start anew. Some of them were afraid of Fan Xian's power and began to secretly prepare to report their colleagues' illegal actions to fight for their innocence. Even more people began to gather in the manor of the masters of the 3 large workshops and secretly discussed how to handle this matter. After the 3 masters of the 3 large workshops were beaten, they could only lie in bed. Although they were in 3 different places, the hatred in their hearts toward Fan Xian and the bitter resentment in their eyes were of one heart. In any case, they were not willing to lower their heads to Fan Xian because they had done too many bad things. Even if they lowered their heads, they would probably not be able to escape death in the future. Among the collusion of these treasurers, the confidant that Xinjiang had left in the treasurers also played a vital role. Using the name of the princess far away in Jingdou, he assured the treasurers that the court's first concern was still the production and profit of the palace treasury and not the small pieces of silver that they were greedy for. What about 1 chopstick? What about 10 chopsticks? In any case, most of the treasurers finally huddled together tightly and began to smash like bowling balls toward Imperial Envoy Fan Xian, who seemed to know nothing and only knew how to take a beauty with him. On the last day of the 3-day order, Fan Xian followed the rules of the previous 2 days and stayed in the Yamen to discuss matters in the morning. Although the treasurers had not voluntarily handed over the stolen goods and admitted their guilt, many of the officials had returned some silver. As for whether or not they had returned the full amount, that was a matter for the future and could be discussed later. At least on the surface, they had acted respectfully. There were also some treasurers who secretly admitted their guilt and took the initiative to climb up to the Overwatch Council to be tainted witnesses. Naturally, Fan Xian accepted them with a smile. It looked like the other party was indeed not a piece of iron. The palace treasury's casting skills were indeed not up to standard. He drank his tea and looked at the fine rain outside the hall in a daze. He slowly thought of the heavy rain last night. Would the Qing kingdom suffer another flood this year? It looked like he had to hurry. Otherwise, before the silver his father wanted could be transported to the banks of the Yangtze River, the banks would collapse again. Sir, an extremely panicked voice exploded like a muffled thunder, waking Fan Xian from his thoughts of a saint. Fan Xian looked with bewilderment and saw a group of officials in completely drenched robes run in. These officials were all people who had gone to each workshop to announce the 3-day order's deadline. Why they all run back? The person in the lead was the second in command of the palace treasury, the deputy of the transport company, Ma Jie. With a face full of shock, he pulled at the front of his robes and rushed in without a care for the dirty water and wet shoes. Sir Ma, why are you so panicked? Fan Xian looked at him and furrowed his brows slightly, putting on a chow-chow air. Sir, it's not good. Although Ma Jie had long known that the treasurers would certainly retaliate against the 3-day order, suddenly hearing of this matter, he couldn't help panicking and quickly came to report to Fan Xian. The 3 large workshops are on strike. Fan Xian was slightly startled and stood dumbly on the stone steps. Ma Jie thought the imperial envoy had also been shaken by the sudden bad news. He wiped the rain from his face and smiled bitterly. This is good, this is good. The 3 large workshops were on strike. This was something that had never happened since the Qing kingdom had taken over the palace treasury. In reality, Fan Xian had not killed anyone. The methods he had used were not as bloody as the eldest princesses. However, the problem was that Fan Xian had issued the 3-day order and had the power of spies in his hands that the eldest princess did not have. He had also blocked the treasurer's plans to transfer their family property. It was the same as preparing to swallow up the money the treasurers had harshly withheld these years. What was money? Money was the life of most people. Thus, the treasurers dared to use such a shocking move as a strike to fight Fan Xian to the death. Fan Xian was only slightly startled and immediately came to his senses. A faint smile rose to the corners of his lips. In reality, he was not shocked by the intensity of the treasurer's reactions. He was just thinking that this world also had a strike. Sir, what do we do? Should we first take back the 3-day order? Ma Jie asked with a face full of hope. He did not approve of Fan Xian issuing the 3-day order. Now that the treasurers had truly gone on strike, and the 3 large workshops of the palace treasury stopped work for 1 day, how much silver would the court lose? Who would be able to shoulder such a large crime? Even if Fan Xian's family background was different from normal people and he was not afraid of the opinions of the people, the emperor would not easily forgive him. Contrary to the expectations of Ma Jie and the other officials, Fan Xian gently stroked the glossy strands of hair on his head and stretched his neck. A faint trace of excitement appeared on his face. As expected, they did not disappoint me. They made a big commotion. This is good. When I catch up, I will kill them all. The officials stood stupidly in the fine rain. On the wooden beam of the yamen, a pair of swallows danced gently. In the sky full of rain, Fan Xian wore the black robe of the Overwatch Council and led the officials of the transport company, a total of over 20 people, hurriedly to the first workshop that had called for a strike. The officials stood outside the workshop and found that they could not hear the sizzling sound of the furnaces. There was also no black smoke coming out of the workshop. There was a death-like silence. Everyone couldn't resist casting their gazes on Fan Xian, thinking, how exactly was he going to deal with this silent protest? No one knew that the Qinian unit and the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau who had followed Fan Xian to Jiangnan were already wearing raincoats and waiting silently not far from the workshop for orders. Even further away, General Ye's face was heavy as he clenched his fists tightly. His heart was perturbed as he spoke with Su Wenmao beside him. His mind was completely on the workshop that was on strike. Behind the 2 of them, a battalion of soldiers with knives and spears in their hands were waiting. The people on strike in the first workshop were all gathered in this large workshop. There was still the remnants of heat from last night inside the workshop. This was where they were responsible for making glass. Fan Xian walked with steady steps into the workshop and raised his head to glance at the tall roof of the workshop. He sighed in admiration and said, The rain protection is done well. The workers were huddled in twos and threes at the back. Their faces were full of fear. These lower-level workers did not know why they had suddenly stopped work. Looking at the newly arrived Imperial envoy, their hearts were filled with fear. In front of the workshop, a dozen green-robed treasurers forced themselves to remain calm and bowed to Fan Xian. Why hasn't work started? Good to let you know. Master Xiao, who was still injured behind him, glanced at Fan Xian with a hateful gaze. Last night, the rain was too heavy and extinguished the furnace. It washed away the molds, so there was no way to start work. The master and treasurers were not idiots. They knew they couldn't openly say they were on strike. Otherwise, if Fan Xian really went crazy and raised a knife to kill them all, they could still justify it. Thus, they could only find some reasons. In reality, they were still using the strike to threaten the other party. Perhaps this was the so-called art of negotiation. In terms of poetry, Fan Xian could be said to be an artist, but his job was often to destroy art without any sense of beauty. With a heavy face, he said, "The molds are ruined, and the furnace is wet." What about the second workshop? Could the molten steel that could burn people to death have also solidified? Can a spinning machine also rust? Without waiting for Master Xiao to reply, he narrowed his eyes and said, "I think you treasurers are the ones whose brains have truly become rusty." There was no such thing as negotiation. Fan Xian only needed someone to make trouble. It was necessary to change the technical director of the palace treasury. How could he miss this opportunity? "Come, cut off this Master Zhao's head for me and use his blood to warm the furnace." Fan Xian clapped his hands and said evenly. Master Xiao paused as if he didn't understand the meaning of the imperial envoy's words. Just as Fan Xian's voice fell, the Overwatch Council officials wearing raincoats had already walked into the workshop. A subordinate lifted up a chair for Fan Xian to sit. A few others had already cleanly kicked Master Xiao to the ground and pulled him to the side of the furnace about 50 feet away from Fan Xian. Fan Xian waved his hand. The officials of the transport company behind him broke into an uproar. Deputy Ma Kai's anxiety attacked his heart, and he cried out in fear, "Sir, you can't." Master Xiao, who had been pushed to the mouth of the furnace, finally came to his senses. He knew the imperial envoy really wanted to kill him, really dared to kill him. He began to struggle with all his might. His feet kicked against the dirt on the ground, making a rustling sound. With a sobbing tone, he cried out, "Spare me, sir, spare me." There were many fools in the world who could not see through the ways of the world. It was a bit too late to beg for mercy when they were about to lose their lives. The eyes of the treasurers who were on good terms with Master Xiao were about to burst. They all rushed forward, wanting to save Master Xiao. With a whoosh, a snow-white knife light flashed. A head with a dark complexion rolled into the furnace. Fresh blood sprayed out and hit the walls of the furnace. Countless cries of shock exploded in the workshop. Everyone was shocked by the bloody scene in front of them. The young treasurers howled in pain and fear. In a flash, they stopped moving forward at the same time. Their survival instincts finally won over the heat in their hearts. Fan Xian glanced at the body at the mouth of the furnace and then at the hundreds of workers gathered together with faces full of fear. Calmly, he said, "I kill people. Naturally, I have my reasons." Chapter 352. The rain pattered down and hit the roof of the workshop with a pitter-patter. It formed a clear contrast with the death-like silence below the roof. The workers in the workshop gathered fearfully at the very back. The terror on their faces was not hidden, but everyone's hands had already begun to unconsciously touch the metal shovels and wooden boards. No one knew what would happen next. Standing at the front, the treasurers in charge of the strike had faces full of fear. Looking at the imperial envoy, sitting in a chair at the entrance of the workshop, no one paid any more attention to the already dead Master Xiao. No one even dared to glance at the wretched sight of the decapitated body by the mouth of the stove. They only stared in terror at Fan Xian's warm and gentle face. Everyone's feet unconsciously retreated. One person retreated, 10 people retreated, everyone retreated. The footsteps of the treasurers as they retreated made a rustling sound, like millipedes crawling in the desert. However, the workshop was only so big, and most of the space at the back was taken up by the thinly dressed workers. Where could these green-clothed treasurers retreat to? Fan Xian looked at the scene in front of him and unconsciously shook his head. In an even voice, he said, "I am not a ruthless person. Workers, do not be afraid. The court is only investigating the matter of the treasurer's embezzlement and deduction of pay. It has nothing to do with you." The workers at the very back looked at each other. Their emotions were slightly calmer, but they did not completely trust this young official. Their hands still gripped the handles of the metal shovels. Even if you're an official of the court, how can you randomly kill people? One of the treasurers finally could not stand the pressure of this silence and cried out in a sharp voice. At this moment, the deputy of the transport company, Ma Jia, was standing stupidly behind Fan Xian. He had not expected that Fan Xian would first behead a master of the workshop without saying anything. This matter had gotten out of hand. How was he going to clean it up? In a trembling voice, he said with shock and anger, "Imperial envoy, why? Everything can be discussed. It's over, it's all over." In Ma Jia's heart, the most important thing in the palace treasury was the group of treasurers in front of him. Only these people knew how to maintain the palace treasury. Even if Fan Xian beheaded a few dozen people today and forced these treasurers to submit, what about in the future? If the treasurers did things with resentment, who knew what would become of the palace treasury? What's more, there are still 2 managers of the first workshop who are also causing a strike. If they find out that you killed Manager Xiao of the first workshop and incited public resentment, the strike will really continue. Oh my God, if you really killed everyone, who would do the work? Could they count on those illiterate workers? Fan Xian ignored the bewildered deputy beside him and motioned for Su Wenmao to come closer. He then said to everyone in the square in a clear voice, "Listen to every word I say." Everyone was taken aback. Su Wenmao took out a few pieces of paper from his drenched robe, squinted his eyes, and began to read loudly. "Today we have found out that the master of the first workshop of the Palace Treasury Transport Company, Xiao Jing, has done many evil and illegal things since the beginning of the year." Su Wenmao furrowed his brows and glanced at the restless treasurers. He continued, "In the 2nd year and 3rd month of the Qin calendar, Xiao Jing hid the Tong Mountain mine disaster and ate the dead salary for 5 years. In total, it was 13,700 liang. In the 4th year and 9th month of the Qin calendar, Xiao Jing bribed the Suzhou master bow and bought 700 mu of fertile land at a low price. In the 6th year and 1st month of the Qin calendar, with Xiao Jing as the leader, the masters of the 3 workshops and a group of treasurers owed the workers more than 10,000 in wages. This caused a riot. 14 people died and over 50 were injured. No one knew how many crimes he listed out. He read them until Su Wenmao's mouth was a little dry. At the end, he said, "The crimes are unforgivable. According to Qing law, they should be executed." He then took out a number of land deeds, the Suzhou master bow's confession, and related evidence. "Don't ask me for evidence again," Fan Xian continued. "I have kept the witnesses, and I also have a lot of material evidence. Since I am the master of the palace treasury, I will not keep such a bastard like Xiao Jing." The workers, who had been trembling uneasily, listened to the imperial envoy discuss the crimes and the list of crimes. They immediately thought of how tyrannical Xiao Jing was and how harsh and sinister he was to the workers under him. Immediately, they felt that the imperial envoy had killed him well. He had killed him well. However, the hatred in the treasurer's eyes grew heavier. Someone shouted unhappily, "Even if you want to punish him, you have to open a court to try the case. If you want to pin a crime on someone, you can always find a pretext." When Deputy Ma Jia, who was standing behind Fan Xian, heard Su Wenmao read out the crimes, he knew that the imperial envoy was looking for an excuse. The things that Xiao Jing had done were actually all known to the officials of the Palace Treasury Transport Company. However, even if he had to be punished according to Qing law, he couldn't just randomly kill him like this. After all, Ma Jia wanted to maintain a good relationship with Fan Xian because of his cousin, Ren Shaoan. No matter how much he disagreed with Fan Xian's style of doing things, he forced his mouth shut and did not question it. He did not question it, but there were still trusted aides left behind by the eldest princess in the transport company who would not let go of this great opportunity. Sinisterly, they said, "Sir, you handle matters decisively. However, it seems that this kind of person who takes bribes and breaks the law should be openly tried and have him personally admitted. Only then can we be wary of thieves and thieves. Furthermore, you gave the treasurers a deadline of 3 days. These 3 days have not passed. Inevitably, the treasurers trembled, but they did not give up. Hearing that someone in the group of officials was speaking up for them, they gathered their courage and began to clamor. Fan Xian did not even turn his head. A cold smile rose to the corners of his lips. I am the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and also the head of the Palace Treasury Transport Company. The Overwatch Council is responsible for investigating cases. The transport company follows the special Qin law, and the case is decided by the head of the transport company. What is wrong with trying him and beheading him? Besides, I am not using these crimes to behead him." He lowered his head slightly and smiled. "Inciting the workers to make trouble, go on strike, and resist the emperor's edict. Do you think I cannot behead such a disrespectful person?" The Qin law was meticulous. For something like killing, it was fine to do it in secret. However, for Fan Xian to kill openly like this, he needed a good excuse. If he only used Xiao Jing's illegal actions as a rope to justify his killing, it would give the officials and treasurers a good opportunity to refute. Beheading a criminal without investigating the case would not be justifiable in any yamen. However, Fan Xian was a very practical person. He had clearly investigated Xiao Jing's crimes. Yet he said that he was beheaded because he disrespected the emperor's edict. Edicts were the most illusory of things. As the imperial envoy, he had the final right to explain. Furthermore, it was necessary for the Overwatch Council to investigate Xiao Jing's crimes. In the future, when the case was brought before the emperor in court in Jingdo, these crimes of forcefully buying good farmland and bullying people to death would be enough to stop any doubts after the fact. Killing at the moment to establish power and collecting evidence after the fact to stop the mouths of the people was a long-term plan. One person had already died in the large workshop of the first workshop. The workers had high hopes for the imperial envoy. The treasurers were as timid as mice. Although the officials had ulterior motives, they could not accuse Fan Xian to his face. The situation slightly stabilized. After another period of time, the second and third workshops also calmed down. However, because those two places were handled by General Yi and Danda, it took a bit more time. These two people were not as daring as Fan Xian. They only dared to capture people and not kill. The treasurers of the other two workshops were escorted by soldiers into the large workshops. The workers were strictly forbidden to stay in each workshop. Even so, the sudden influx of 200 green-clothed treasurers still made the large workshop immediately appear crowded. However, with the cold light of the military's knives and spears and the Overwatch Council's arrows pressing in, no matter how crowded the crowd was, no one dared to move. Seeing this scene, the officials of the transport company who had followed Fan Xian into the workshop were shocked. Only now did the officials know that the imperial envoy had long made arrangements for the situation on the last day of the 3-day order. Furthermore, he seemed to have long guessed that the treasurers would have an extreme reaction. For a moment, the trusted officials of Xinjiang were all disappointed. It looked like the chaos today would not be too big. At the same time, they were hoping that Fan Xian would be more ruthless later. It would be best if he could offend all of the treasurers. In the future, the palace treasury would decrease production and quality would drop. Let's see how you explain that to the emperor. After the workshop was quiet for a while, Fan Xian stood up from his chair. The small puffs of water that had been in his robe flowed to the ground. He looked at the group of treasurers in front of him. He saw that there was still dissatisfaction in their eyes. The treasurers who had been escorted here from the second and third workshops still had arrogant expressions. It was as if they did not know what had happened. "Everyone is here," he said with a warm smile. He smiled warmly and said, "It rained heavily last night, and the fire in this workshop was extinguished. What about your side? Also, the workshop treasures are clearly 30 or 40 li away. Why are you all so close to the yamen today? Even if the workshops have stopped work because of the rain, you should still go to your own workshops to keep an eye on them. It is still early. Have you all already gone and then turned back?" He continued to talk to himself. The treasurers, through the explanation of the treasurers who had been left behind in the workshop, finally knew what had happened. Their faces gradually paled. Fan Xian shook his head and said, "This is good. Everyone's crime of going on strike has been confirmed. It will be easier for me to kill." After Master Zhao's unusual and straightforward death and the spread of words, the treasurers finally knew that the imperial envoy was a ruthless character who killed without blinking. Hearing these light words, the treasurers exploded with a buzz. Some begged for mercy, some cursed viciously, and some rolled their eyes as if trying to see if there was a dog hole in the workshop they could crawl out of. The crowd gradually dispersed. The situation was slightly chaotic. However, the army and Overwatch Council on the outside kept a close watch and forced everyone back. Two people squeezed out from among the treasurers. They were not bystanders. They were the three leaders of this strike, the main treasurers of the second and third workshops. Earlier, these two masters had been high-spirited in the largest workshop under their jurisdiction. Eloquently, they had directed the treasurers and workers to go on strike. Their words flowed like a river, and their aura was astonishing. Although the workers looked weakly and unintentionally at the two of them, the hundreds of treasurers had been moved by their words. They thought that given the intelligence in their heads, the court would not be able to punish them severely. Of course, these two masters had also strictly ordered the treasurers to be incomparably respectful toward the imperial envoy. What they wanted was for the silver in their homes not to be taken by the court and not for them to truly rebel. Unexpectedly, not long after the strike, countless soldiers and secret agents of the Overwatch Council charged in from outside the workshop. Faced with weapons, the two masters' words immediately lost their power. They obediently allowed themselves to be captured and escorted here. Along the way, they were still confident. They thought to themselves that they knew what they were doing and that the imperial envoy would not be able to do anything to them. Unexpectedly, the imperial envoy did not know what he was doing. After standing in a crowd for a while, the two masters finally realized that Master Xiao, who had plotted with them to go on strike, had died. The two masters stood outside the crowd and looked around the workshop. Finally, they found Xiao Jing's body by the mouth of the stove. In an instant, the bloodstains and head stunned their hearts. The two of them cried out sorrowfully, "Sir Xiao! Sir Xiao!" There were knives and spears all around them, so they didn't dare to go to the side of the stove and cry out. However, they still raised their heads and glanced at Fan Xian with a venomous gaze. They knew that they would probably not be able to escape today. Fan Xian did not look at them. He only tilted his head slightly and listened to Danda's report. When he learned that the third workshop was as usual and that the technicians of the third bureau of the Overwatch Council had all taken over and no one dared to take advantage of the chaos to do anything, he finally relaxed. At this moment, a tiger guard who was supposed to be stationed in the manor quietly moved past the officials and came to Fan Xian's side. Moving close to his ear, he said, "The person in the manor wants to go out for a walk." The reason the third workshop was important was because it was responsible for producing important items such as military equipment and ships. If the secrets of that place were leaked, who knew how many more young people in the Qing Kingdom would die on the battlefield in the future? Fan Xian did not dare to take this responsibility. Originally, he had felt slightly more at ease listening to Danda's report. However, after hearing the Tiger Guard's report, his brows furrowed again. Haidang had disguised herself as a serving girl to follow him. She could fool the officials and many people, but she could not fool Gao Da's eagle-like eyes. Although Fan Xian realized that he had made a big mistake, it was already too late to make up for it. Fortunately, the Chinian unit was watching in secret. The Tiger Guards did not release any information to the outside world. Only then did he feel slightly more at ease. He began to wonder again. However, now was not the time to deal with this matter. The person the Tiger Guard was referring to was Haitang. It looked like that village girl knew that there would be a commotion today and probably wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to do something. Fan Xian calmly said, "Don't go out. Keep an eye on her. Use all methods to keep her in the manor today." 7 Tiger Guards against Haitang was the standard arrangement on the meadow last year. Fan Xian was not worried about anything. Furthermore, once military force met, Haitang knew his determination and would calm down. After dealing with his own matters, Fan Xian turned his gaze back to the scene and said, "Tie up these 2 criminals who instigated trouble and fought against the court." Soldiers had long gone forward to tie up the 2 masters. Although the treasurers' faces were filled with fear and hatred, no one dared to go forward to help. For one, there was the violent machine in front of them. For another, these treasurers had earned their fill of silver these years and truly did not have the courage to fight ruthlessly. The more money a person had, the more cowardly they were. Fan Xian saw this matter very clearly. Sir Fan, the 2 masters did not resist. Somewhat numbly, they allowed the soldiers to tie up their hands. However, the second master continued to stare faintly at Fan Xian's face. "If you want to kill me, then kill me. But how will you explain this to the court in the future? Are you threatening me?" Fan Xian smiled. "On the way here, I once said something. If Butcher Zhang is dead, do I have to eat furred pigs? Without you little treasurers, do you think I won't be able to take care of the palace treasury?" The second master laughed wretchedly and said, "Is that so? We have indeed underestimated the imperial envoy's determination, but you also seem to have underestimated these unremarkable workshops." His last words were practically shouted out. It was clear he had already lost all hope, but he also had the ruthless thought of seeing how Fan Xian would destroy the palace treasury, even if he became a ghost. Fan Xian glanced at Su and Mao. Su and Mao took out another file from his robe. With a serious face, he began to read out the names one by one according to the names written on the paper. Zhang San, Li Si, Wang Ba, Long Jiao. Following the names of these minor characters being read out one by one, the faces of the dozen people in the group of treasurers immediately became deathly white. They didn't know if they were about to be beheaded like Master Shao of the first workshop. A few of the more timid one's legs trembled, and a large patch of their pants became wet. Su Wenmao glanced at these people with disgust. He didn't understand why the commissioner was doing this. After swallowing, he said with a dark expression, "You can come out now. The imperial envoy has pardoned you of no crime. Tomorrow, he will write to the court to vouch for you." Not guilty? He still had a right to the court? The treasurers who had been called out were immediately dumbfounded. They had thought it was hell. Who knew that it was heaven with cool spring water and 72 virgins? Under the puzzled, suspicious, and jealous gazes of the treasurers around them, these dozen treasurers walked out of the crowd stupidly. They walked in front of Fan Xian and knelt down with a thud, thanking the imperial envoy, but they didn't understand why it was like this. Fan Xian's face was filled with a warm smile. His 2 hands lifted the treasurers up. As he acted, he said in an even voice, to be able to capture the true crimes of the 3 masters and know that there were so many illegal things among the treasurers, "It is all because you placed righteousness above family and were wholeheartedly loyal to the court. Otherwise, I would not have known that the palace treasury would be in such a mess, nor would I have known that there were people who dared to incite a strike and make trouble. You have all done a service to the country, so I will not mistreat you." The marketplace was immediately in an uproar. So these dozen treasurers were spies. Even the officials behind Fan Xian were dumbfounded. They thought to themselves, the imperial envoy had only been in the palace treasury for 3 days. How could he have developed so many spies? The reputation of being a secret agent of the Overwatch Council was indeed not false. The treasurers knew that the dozen colleagues Fan Xian had asked to leave had secretly betrayed them. They couldn't help but fly into a rage. Although they didn't go forward to beat them, they began to curse them viciously. Filthy words flew through the air and burrowed into the ears of the spies. Where were the spies and treasurers? They had originally loved Sir Fan Jr. to death, but now they hated him to death. Yes, they had secretly returned the treasury silver and secretly said a few things they had heard, but it was not as serious as Sir Fan Jr. had said. They had only learned about the strike last night, or would they have had the time to report it? As for Master Shao and the other two masters, God, they just wanted to be a pretty fence-sitter. How would they dare offend the head of the treasurers? These treasurers, who had been condemned by thousands of people, looked at each other. They wanted to cry, but had no tears. Even if Fan Xian let them go today, he had publicly pointed out their shameless and betrayal in front of everyone. How could they face their 200 colleagues in the future? How could they face others? Zhang Sen looked at Li Si. Wang Ba looked at Long Jiao. With sorrowful eyes, they asked, "You're also a spy?" "Yes, we're also a spy." What Fan Xian said next shocked the people in the workshop. These 13 treasurers bravely exposed the abuses and have done the country a service. I have decided that from now on, they will be the deputy masters of the 3 workshops. Fan Xian smiled warmly and asked the deputy beside him, "Sir Ma, what do you think of this proposal?" Deputy Ma Jie was still worried about how the palace treasury could produce normally and felt depressed. However, hearing these words, he still repeatedly nodded his head in agreement. In the depths of his heart, he felt great admiration for Fan Xian. This move was truly beautiful, exposing the shameless faces of the spies of the treasurers. In the future, when the treasury was governed, these people would be used as claws and teeth. There was no need to worry that they would not be convinced. This was an artificial chasm drawn out among the treasurers. If today's matter could be concluded satisfactorily, it would be difficult for the treasurers in the future to come together again and become a class that could oppose the officials. Suddenly, someone laughed coldly. Everyone focused their eyes and saw it was the second workshop treasurer who was tied up and kneeling on the ground. They saw him laugh coldly and sorrowfully. What a group of shameless people. Sir Fan, do you think you can rely on these people to keep the palace treasury running like before? I'm not threatening the court, but without the things in our heads, the palace treasury probably won't last more than a few days. After these words were said, the atmosphere became strange again. Deputy Ma Jie wanted to move closer to Fan Xian's ear to plead for mercy, but he didn't know how to say it. The trusted aides of Xinyang among the officials of the transport company also began to openly think for the court, while secretly cheering for the master. They all advised Fan Xian that everything should be done for the sake of the palace treasury's production. Killing this Master Shao was already enough of a lesson for the other party. Fan Xian would not listen to these words. He only stared at the second workshop master and didn't speak for a moment. That pair of sharp and clear eyes stared at the second workshop master until he could no longer bear it and slowly lowered his head. At this moment, Fan Xian said angrily, "You're at death's door, and you still dare to threaten the court, treasurers? I'll tear off your underwear and put it on your face to see if what grows on your neck is a head or a butt." The imperial envoy's thunderous anger made the workshop fall into absolute silence. Fan Xian swept his gaze across the treasurers and said with pity and anger in his disdain, "Do you really think you're so promising? Do you think the palace treasury is still the Yi family of the past? Don't you look at your little bit of ability and say other people are shameless people? What about you? Other than being greedy for silver, stealing materials to sell, embezzling hard-earned wages, and forcefully taking other people's wives, what else can you do? Shameless? If you were shameless, there wouldn't be today's matter." He turned and said angrily to the second workshop master, "You're very stubborn. The palace treasury can't do without you? Then tell me, how come the glass has become more and more muddy these years? How come the wine is so bland that it's about to give birth to a bird? The perfume has already stopped production for 10 years. Have you found a way yet? Back then, you were also a servant of the Yi family, old man." Fan Xian's heart was pained, and he opened his mouth to curse at the master. How did you F asterisk king fall to this level? I'm about to F asterisk king die of anger. Everyone in the workshop shivered. Only now did the slow-witted people remember that there seemed to be a rumor. The angry imperial envoy in front of them was a descendant of the Yi family. F asterisk king? F asterisk king me? Whose mother would be angry? There is something I need to explain. Yesterday's chapter finished very comfortably. I thought to myself that no one would say the plot stopped halfway. In the end, there were still brothers and sisters who seriously criticized me. It is very difficult for me to be happy. Originally, yesterday's chapter should have ended when the deputy called for the palace treasury to go on strike. Furthermore, I was also very tired. However, I thought that being stuck halfway probably made everyone uncomfortable, so I wrote another 1,000 words. I thought about it, so I wrote another 1,000 words. The plot developed naturally, but there was a limit to how many words I could write each day. It was not purposely left there. Please understand, bravo. Thinking about it from another perspective, it meant that the current plot was rather attractive. Haha, I comforted myself. Of course, this paragraph does not count. All right, my spirit is a little weak. I'll report this first. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 353. The master knelt on the ground. His face was red and white. Hearing the words, Yi family, he remembered the true identity of the person in front of him. A sliver of memory that had been hidden for many years slowly rose. It made him feel ashamed, angry, and afraid. The feeling of shame was easy to understand. After all, back then, he was just a little beggar by the side of the road. To be able to get to where he was now, it was all because of the Yi family. How had the young lady of the Yi family educated people like him? As for the anger and fear, it came from his natural reaction. It was a kind of shame and anger after being stripped naked. Thinking that the imperial envoy was a descendant of the Yi family, he was afraid that whatever he knew in his head, the other party would also know. Then, how could he use those things to threaten the other party? The other party had cut down Master Shao with one strike. Could he not cut him? The court has treated you well. Fan Xian looked at him and said each word clearly. Fan Xian looked at him and said each word clearly. Putting aside you three masters, even a normal treasurer's annual salary is even more than a third-level official in Jingdao. What are you not satisfied with? A glimmer of coldness flashed through his eyes. Do you think that the production of the palace treasury all depends on your heads? That the 20 million liang of silver every year blinds your eyes and makes you feel dissatisfied and that you should earn more? These words hit the bottom of the treasurer's hearts. The palace treasury's annual production was abundant and sold to various countries under heaven. It brought the Qing kingdom a great profit. Although the treasurer's treatment was already very high compared to that enormous sum of silver, they still felt uncomfortable in their hearts. They always felt that they earned money for the court and should be given more. This was why they privately took bribes, bent the law, and oppressed the common people. Hearing the imperial envoy say this, although the treasurers did not talk back, the meaning appeared in their eyes. Fan Xian laughed coldly and ruthlessly tore away their masks. Lightly mocking, he said, "The problem is the things you rely on, are they really the things in your heads?" There was a silence. Everyone, including the officials, acknowledged this reality until Fan Xian said, "Don't forget, before the Yi family appeared, what did you know? Did the technology in your heads fall from heaven? Was it taught by the temple?" Fan Xian scolded. "All of you remember it clearly. This is what the Yi family taught you. Without the young lady of the Yi family, you are just trash, continuing to dig the fields and beg. Why did the Yi family build these workshops in the past? I think all of you have forgotten that you are in front of this official. You still want to use the things that the Yi family taught you to threaten this official. Do you have any shame? Do you have any shame?" The officials behind him looked at each other. Although the court had long stopped pursuing the matter of the Yi family, and Sir Fan Jr.'s past was gradually known to the people of the world. To speak of the Yi family so openly was still somewhat taboo. Fan Xian could not care so much. He was angry, but he wanted to use this opportunity to clear his name. In this world, no matter what you did, you had to be justified. Fan Xian had scolded the treasurers and beheaded them. Disregarding the benefits, he had first taken the flag on a moral level. The manager of the second workshop finally softened. He knelt on the ground and wailed, "My lord, this lowly one knows his mistake. Please, my lord, give this lowly one a chance. Let this lowly one use the skills I learned in the past to serve the court." Although this master was wailing in pain, Fan Xian's sharp eyes did not find any traces of tears on his face. On the contrary, the corners of his lips were pressed tightly together. He couldn't help but smile coldly. He knew that the others still thought he wouldn't continue killing and that the things in his head were still useful. Fan Xian gently clapped his hands. When the clapping was about to end, 4 old men around 50 years old were escorted into the workshop by Overwatch Council officials. These old men were not bystanders. They were the shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall, who had come back from the Central Plain via Danzhou. The Overwatch Council officials set out 4 chairs. Fan Xian rose and, expressionless but deliberately respectful, invited the 4 shopkeepers to sit. The officials, treasurers, and workers were all confused. They wondered who these old men who seemed like they would be blown over by the slightest breeze had the right to sit side by side with the imperial envoy. Although the deputy, Ma Jia, didn't say anything, he was muttering in his heart. He thought, "Even I am standing behind the imperial envoy. How dare these commoners?" Fan Xian's fingers slid across the robe on his body and dipped into some icy rainwater. He smeared it between his brows and slowly rubbed it. He asked, "Do you still recognize who these 4 are?" Nearly 20 years had passed since the Yi family's collapse. The workers in the palace treasury workshop were no longer the same as before. Even the treasurers had never seen the high and mighty 23-head shopkeepers of the Yi family, so they did not recognize who these 4 people were. Even though they were old men from back then, they were too far away and could not distinguish clearly. On the other hand, the second workshop's manager, who was kneeling on the ground, slowly swept his hesitant gaze across the 4 people's faces. He lowered his head and thought for a long while. Suddenly, he seemed to have thought of something and was so shocked that his legs gave way. His originally kneeling posture, he immediately sat down on the muddy water. It had been 20 years since they had seen each other. As a small helper of the Yi family, it took him a long time to remember who the people sitting in front of him were, the old shopkeepers of the Yi family. The second workshop master's body began to tremble. Only now did he know why Fan Xian was so fearless, why he had forced him, the treasurers, to rebel, and why he did not care about what they remembered in their minds. He had brought the old shopkeepers, who had been under house arrest in Jingdou, to the palace treasury. What kind of people were the old shopkeepers? They were the first group of students of a young lady of the Yi family. They were also the masters of all the teachers and helpers of the Yi family. They were also the ancestors of the present palace treasury treasurers. With such a group of old men at his side, the imperial envoy did not care about the problem of lost craftsmanship, nor did he have to worry about the quality of the palace treasury's products. Truthfully speaking, the palace treasury had been single-handedly built by these old shopkeepers. How could they not be managed? Thinking this through, the master's face was full of despair, but there was still a glimmer of hope in the depths of his heart. Opening his mouth, he struggled to crawl toward Fan Xian and wailed, "Teacher, please ask for leniency on behalf of your disciple." Everyone was startled, and Fan Xian was also slightly surprised. He knew that this person was not asking for leniency from him. Following the master's gaze, he found that he was looking at 7th Yi. He couldn't help tilting his head and asking curiously, "7th Yi, was he your former disciple?" 7th Yi's face darkened. He stared at the master's face and said in a raspy voice full of resentment, "He learned from me for a few days." Fan Xian smiled slightly. He understood 7th Yi's feelings. After the Yi family collapsed, The 23 old shopkeepers have been captured by the court from various places and placed under house arrest in Jingdo. Some of their disciples had resisted and died, while others struggled at death's door. Of course, this was all people's own choice in the face of impending disaster. No one blamed them. However, for someone like the second master who had climbed to such a high position, his behavior back then must have been very bad. Hearing the second master call out, "Teacher," the third master, who had been standing silently to the side, froze to the side like he had been struck by lightning. Looking at the four old men sitting beside the imperial envoy, he completely couldn't believe his ears. The remaining members of the Yi family, among the treasurers, confirmed the identities of these four people. Amidst their shock, there were also some people who still had old memories. They all stood up and knelt in front of the four old shopkeepers with shock, joy, and fear. Fourth Master. Uncle Twelfth, I am Zhu Zi. Greetings, old shopkeepers. Back then, I was a worker in the Chuzhou branch doing odd jobs. Although most of the treasurers did not have much of a relationship with these four old shopkeepers, the palace treasury meeting to recognize relatives was already bustling with activity. Fan Xian's face darkened, and he said in a cold voice, "I'll come back to recognize relatives in a bit." Although his expression was unhappy, his heart had calmed down. With the 13 spies as deputy masters and the remaining power of these old shopkeepers, his plan to reform the palace treasury should be able to proceed smoothly. Meeting again after 20 years, the atmosphere in the workshop immediately became somewhat sad. This kind of sadness perfectly diluted the earlier tension. Only the officials of the transport company felt uneasy, and some of the Xinjiang people laughed coldly to themselves. If the scene in front of them got back to Jingdo, the emperor would probably have some opinions about Commissioner Fan. The second master lowered his head and knelt on the ground. He also felt slightly comforted in his heart. Looking at this situation, at most he would receive some punishment. In a moment, he would desperately admit his mistake. For the sake of the old Yi family, the imperial envoy probably wouldn't make things too difficult for him. He glanced sideways at the body of Master Shao in the distance at the mouth of the furnace and felt a lingering fear in his heart. Fortunately, Shao Jing had stepped forward first. He also felt some sympathy for that bastard. He thought to himself that a person who had no connection to the old Yi family had indeed died cleanly under the hands of the imperial envoy. Unexpectedly, after Fan Xian had repulsed the treasurers, a faint smile rose to his face, and he said, "Take this person away and behead him." "Yes, sir." The second master raised his head and looked around with a perplexed gaze. For a moment, he didn't understand who to behead. Shouldn't things be like this? It was not until he was dragged up by the Overwatch Council officials that he realized the imperial envoy still wanted to kill him. He had wanted to open his mouth to cry out for his innocence, but a clump of dirt blocked his mouth. Seeing the Overwatch Council officials drag the limp master out of the workshop and the water stain on the ground, everyone in the workshop, regardless of whether they were officials or commoners, shopkeepers or treasurers, became deathly silent. They all turned their gazes toward the imperial envoy, sitting in the middle. It was as if Fan Xian could not feel the countless gazes and lowered his head slightly. Outside the workshop came the muffled sound of a metal weapon striking a neck, as well as a muffled grunt. There was an uproar in the workshop and immediately sank into a death-like silence. Everyone knew that the second master had died so simply. The silence did not last long. The third master, with his hands tied behind his back, smiled self-mockingly. His face was pale with despair. Very consciously, he walked in front of Fan Xian. He knew that he had no chance of survival. Since the imperial envoy had used the name of suppressing the strike, then he would not be stupid enough to open a court to investigate the case. He also did not need any evidence. He had to kill the three of them on the spot to establish his might. Only then could the four old shopkeepers regain control of the palace treasury technicians. Two of the masters of the three workshops had already died, so he was the third. Fan Xian glanced at him and furrowed his brows slightly. The third master looked at him and gritted his teeth for a moment. He then suddenly said, I have my own path to death. I don't blame you for digging this pit for me to jump into. However, before I die, I beg you to allow me to ask something." Fan Xian raised his brows and said, "Ask." The third master no longer looked at him. He tilted his head and gazed at the Yi family's 12th shopkeeper beside him. His lips trembled for a while before he said in a trembling voice, "12th uncle, my teacher, is he well in the capital? I'm unfilial and have not been filial these years." "You are?" 12th Yi blinked his slightly muddy eyes and asked this master with confusion. 7th Yi sighed and said from the side, "13th's eldest disciple. Back then, you had the best relationship with 12th, so he came to ask you." 12th Yi said in shock, "Hu Jinlin, you're still alive? We all thought you died back then." The old shopkeeper suddenly remembered that he was surrounded by court officials. His words were not quite right, so he quickly shut his mouth. Hu Jinlin's face was full of shame. He lowered his head and refused to speak. 12th Yi sighed and said, "The young lady once said that living is better than dying. Us old bones are all struggling at death's door. How can we blame you? Only you asked 13th, ah." The shopkeeper shook his head and said, "He already passed away a few years ago. Of the 23 people who enter the capital, there are only 15 left now." Hearing that his teacher had passed away, Hu Jinlin completely forgot that he was about to die as well. A great sorrow appeared on his face. Fan Xian listened quietly to the side. Fan Xian listened quietly to the side. He also felt a strange emotion in his heart. The elders of the Yi family were gradually being battered by the wind and rain. The year he first entered Jingdo, there were 23 shopkeepers and 17 people. In less than 2 years, another 2 had died. He looked at the materials piled around the workshop and abruptly became distracted. He thought to himself that time flowed like water. When would he be able to rebuild the name of the Yi family? When would he be able to have the people who should die die and have the people who should live again in the hearts of the Qing people? In a very short time, he had already woken up. Looking at the third master in front of him, he said mockingly, "Although I don't know if you're acting or if you really still have feelings for me, I never planned on killing you. So don't think that you can live because I'm soft-hearted." Hu Jinlin, who thought he was going to die, had no hope of getting lucky after the tragic deaths of his 2 masters. Suddenly hearing these words, on the contrary, he was so shocked he didn't know what to say. Fan Xian said expressionlessly, "Those who are guilty are beheaded, and those who have committed minor crimes are forgiven. I'm not here to settle old grudges." To be continued. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 354. The reason Fan Xian did not kill Hu Jinlin was very simple. The third workshop had always been jointly managed by the Palace Treasury and the Third Bureau of the Overwatch Council. They were specifically responsible for the research of military equipment and ships. The Third Bureau of the Overwatch Council had always been Fan Xian's fellow disciples, so they understood the situation of the third workshop the best. Hu Jinlin was wholeheartedly engrossed in studying the blueprints the mistress of the Yi family had left behind. His personality was wooden and dull. Although he had embezzled a great deal of silver, he had never done something that Fan Xian could not tolerate, such as taking over fields and bullying women. Compared to the masters of the first and second workshops, there was indeed a reason for him not to be killed. Of course, the most important reason was that Fan Xian did not want to kill him. From another angle, it showed that he was not a righteous official. The master of the third workshop was taken away. There were still many treasurers left in the workshop. These people looked at each other. At the beginning of the strike, everyone was secretly anxious in their hearts, but they still had some confidence. It was not the first time the treasurers had banded together to oppose the officials of the court's transport company. In the past, as long as their requests were not excessive, the matter would always be resolved peacefully. In their eyes, they only wanted to protect the silver they had extorted and harshly withheld over these years. It was indeed a reasonable request. However, No one had thought that the new imperial envoy would be so vicious and merciless. After pointing out the nature of the palace treasury and inviting out the 4 old Yi family shopkeepers, the treasurers all knew that all of their trump cards had lost all effect in front of this young official. At this moment, the treasurers were just a flock of chickens waiting to be slaughtered. It was just a matter of how many Fan Xian wanted to slaughter. Not many. Following Su Wenmao's naming and statement of crimes, another 3 treasurers were pulled out from the crowd. These 3 treasurers had done many evil things and secretly colluded with the officials of the Suzhou government. The matters they had handled had violated countless Qing laws. Killing them 16 or 17 times was not enough. Fan Xian accepted the file in Su Wenmao's hands and glanced at the treasurers in front of him who had wet his pants and couldn't even stand steadily. He furrowed his brows and said, "You're the one who married 12 concubines?" The treasurers didn't even have the strength to nod. He was terrified. Fan Xian shook his head and mockingly said, "Marrying 12 concubines only shows that you are rich and have a lot of confidence in the bed between husband and wife. But out of the 12 concubines, 9 of them were taken by force. That is very shameful. Stealing someone's wife and killing their own husband? Impressive, impressive. You are even more arrogant than the most famous hedonistic playboy in the capital." Although the other 2 treasurers did not commit such a crime, they still deserved to die. Fan Xian waved his hand. The Overwatch Council officials dragged the 3 treasurers out. Following the sound of 3 knives and 3 wretched cries, 3 lives were lost. Killing people without a change in expression was something the Overwatch Council officials could do. Even the soldiers by the side of the workshop could barely do it. However, the officials of the Palace Treasury Transport Company could not take it anymore. Their backs were drenched in sweat. Some of them smelled the blood inside and outside the workshop and wanted to vomit. Deputy Ma Jie was still relatively calm, but the sweat on his face began to drip furiously. Pitifully, he moved closer to Fan Xian's ear and said, "Sir, in a few days, the palace treasury will open for bidding. Killing people is inauspicious. Killing people is inauspicious." Naturally, there was no way to save the people who had been killed, but Ma Jie was afraid that Fan Xian's vicious nature would explode and continue to kill. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Sir Ma, don't worry. 6 years ago, Ma Yu, the eldest princess, personally came to the palace treasury for the last time. How many treasurers did she kill?" He extended his thumb and pinky finger and said, 6. "I am a junior, so naturally, I won't kill too many. I've already killed 5. That's enough." Hearing these 2 words, the hearts of the officials behind him relaxed involuntarily. The treasurers in front of them were wild with joy. Regardless of who it was, they were all frightened by the 5 bloody heads until their legs felt weak. Only Su Wenmao suppressed the displeasure in his heart after a moment of surprise and didn't say anything. Deputy Ma Jie furrowed his brows, thinking that there was more to the imperial envoy's words. The eldest princess had killed 6, and he had only killed 5. If this matter went wrong in the future and the imperial censors reported him for violating court law and killing indiscriminately, it looked like there would be an explanation. It seemed that although this imperial envoy was young, his thoughts were ruthlessly meticulous. He could not miss the path that his cousin, Ren Shaolin, had painstakingly paved for him. After thinking through this matter, Deputy Ma Jie solemnly agreed to Fan Xian's following appointments and measures without a trace of evasion or conflict. Although some of the officials of the Palace Treasury Transport Company were unhappy, since the head and deputy had set the rules, they could not oppose it. In Fan Xian's plan, the masters of the 3 large workshops were either dead or imprisoned. It just so happened to free up the 3 most important positions for the 3 old Yi family shopkeepers to temporarily hold. Additionally, the traitor treasurers who had reported their colleagues' crimes to the Overwatch Council would take on the positions as assistants. It could be considered making up for the old shopkeepers' lack of familiarity with the palace treasury after not returning for 20 years. Killing first and planting spies among them. With these arrangements, the entire group of treasurers could be considered stabilized. In the future, the traitor treasurers only had to guard against the treasurers below them feeling discontent and purposely picking on their mistakes. When they did things, they had to be particularly careful. Once the group stood, these deputy masters would be particularly vicious and stare at the subordinate treasurers. The two clashed. Presumably, the things that Fan Xian did not want to see would gradually decrease. 3-day order. There's still half a day, Fan Xian said. Don't look at me. I know you can all read. Go back. Some of the workshops that you should be in are hundreds of li away. If you don't hurry home to raise the money and then return to the workshop to work, are you going to continue standing here like clay figurines? Fan Xian said, Those who didn't die, spit out the silver and give me a clear account of what you have done. Write a note yourself. His voice gradually became cold at the end. After saying this, he walked out of the large workshop under the terrified gazes of the treasurers. The soldiers general he led gradually dispersed. The Overwatch Council officials all returned to their positions. It was still unknown who the spies placed in the workshops were. The officials whispered among themselves, but no one knew what they were talking about. The workers had watched a great show. After the treasurers had been taught a lesson through blood and fire, they became particularly obedient and terrified. The heavy rain outside gradually stopped. A lively palace treasury strike incident ended in such an absurd and nonsensical manner under Fan Xian's knife and the shopkeepers' old faces. The treasurers and officials returned the silver smoothly. After Fan Xian had examined them one by one, he also gently raised his noble hand. As long as they did not hide it too far, he left them some face and did not squeeze everyone dry of their family property. Being an official was only for money. If they were all swept clean, the officials of the palace treasury would not be able to show it on the surface, but they would certainly have a great knot in their hearts. When they did things, they would be incomparably lazy. Even with all 5 fingers spread open and pulling at the silver, the Yaman's 3-day order still recovered a large amount of silver. Even though Fan Xian's family was extremely wealthy and he had seen a lot of things in this life, looking at the number on the account, he still sucked in a cold breath in shock. He felt a faint regret in his heart. This matter had become a big deal. It was impossible to hide it from Jingdou. Under the eyes of everyone, the silver that was cleared, other than the wages owed to the workers these years, had to be sent into the palace treasury's special accounts. It was impossible for him to move it personally. If he had known earlier that the treasurers were the fattest corrupt officials in the world, perhaps Fan Xian would not have organized such a purge. Instead, he would have directly had the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council be thieves. Other than things like land deeds, he would have stolen the rest of the banknotes in his own private hands. He was currently short of silver. If he could have this large sum of silver, he would no longer need the help of the North, and it would prevent new problems from arising in the process. More importantly, it would also allow his father to stay out of the matter, so that he would not be implicated in the future bidding. Returning to Haidang, after that day of the strike, Fan Xian returned to the manor and bitterly complained to this girl. Other than righteousness, he analyzed the current situation in detail and warned her that the Qing emperor probably already knew that the two of them were together. If she dared to go peep in the workshops in front of the Tiger Guards, he probably wouldn't be able to sit in his position in the palace treasury for more than 2 days. If he couldn't stay in the palace treasury, how much more silver would Northern Qi have to fork out in a year? Haidang was a bit innocent. She thought that she was just bored, so she wanted to go for a walk. How did it involve some conspiracy? Fan Xian was a bit suspicious. On the surface, he didn't bring up the matter again, but in his heart, he was still a bit uncomfortable. Fortunately, the palace treasury affairs were gradually moving on the right track. This process only needed a few days. It had to be said that Fan Xian's cold-faced killing during the strike had deeply intimidated everyone. Furthermore, the old shopkeeper's reappearance and Fan Xian's clever arrangements had all played a large role. The workers once again received the wages they had worked for many years. The girls who had been forcefully taken also returned to their homes. The entire palace treasury floor was filled with an atmosphere of joy. Amidst the joyous atmosphere, there were also some discordant notes mixed in. Although Fan Xian's thoughts were meticulous and had long guessed some of it, he had used the power of the government ahead of time to suppress those bitter stories from happening. The Qin Kingdom's common people's own stories were always complicated. The common people did not like those women, but they were used to living happy lives with the little treasurer. Once the situation changed, they were not used to it. The treasurers did not have sex in the middle of the night, so there were not many cases of forcefully taking concubines. Although there were not many cases, it involved matters between men and women. It created a bad influence among the people. Fan Xian was vexed, but he didn't have any good ideas. It was difficult for an upright official to resolve family matters. A ruthless official, was also not that strong, so he could only toss it aside. However, these were just small interludes. On a larger level, the authority of the new head of the Palace Treasury Transport Company, Imperial Envoy Fan Xian, had already been established. Furthermore, in the hearts of the tens of thousands of low-level workers in the Palace Treasury, he had firmly forged an image of being upright and outspoken, incorruptible and wise. Presently, he no longer needed the help of the Eighth Bureau. With his reputation as a civil and military official, Fan Xian had long become familiar with these methods. The Palace Treasury gradually calmed down. However, the strike had ended, but Fan Xian's plan had only just begun. To beat the snake to scare it, one half of the two-headed snake had been ruthlessly killed by him. With the other injured, it was time to begin moving. "Is there any new news from Ziyue?" Fan Xian asked casually as he sat in a chair and looked with narrowed eyes at today's council reports. Su Wenmao replied, "Not so fast. According to your orders, even if those Xinjiang officials send the news out, it will take at least a month for them to come and go." Fan Xian sighed. The imperial censors in the court do things too slowly. Su Wenmao smiled bitterly, thinking, how could there be someone like the commissioner in the world who waited for the imperial censors to come and report him? It was only because his background was strong enough that he could sit so calmly. "We can't wait anymore. Tomorrow, we'll capture those people," Fan Xian said. The target of these words was, of course, the trusted officials Xinjiang had left in the Palace Treasury. At the beginning of the three-day order, these officials had secretly stirred up the emotions of the treasurers and incited them to oppose Fan Xian. After Fan Xian demonstrated his bloody methods, these officials were as happy as if they had eaten a sweet jujube. Throughout the night, they thought of ways to send out memorials without asking. Of course, it was to report to the officials of the eldest princess faction in Jingdo. At the beginning, Fan Xian had allowed the treasurers to link up for 3 days and finally form a strike to force the emperor to abdicate. It was for the sake of making the pustules in the palace treasury grow more plentiful and to see who was playing tricks. Before and after, the Overwatch Council's secret agents watched the many officials in the transport company with great caution. These people had no way of escaping the net Fan Xian had laid out. "Let's do it," Fan Xian said with a pained smile. "We're all leaving. We can't keep them here to eat porridge." Su Wenmao made a sound of acknowledgement and asked with confusion, "Sir, why didn't you cover up the news at the beginning? After all, there was a strike this time. Once the court in Jingdo discussed it, if Xinjiang did something else, I'm afraid your days would not be easy." Fan Xian fell silent. His fingers gently tapped against the armrest of the chair. This was a very common behavior when he was thinking about a problem. After thinking for a while, he decided to explain a bit more to his trusted aide. He raised his head and explained, "The palace treasury is divided into 2 parts. The workshops are the foundation, and the export merchants are the hands and feet. If I want to break someone's hands and feet, I have to first lay down a solid foundation. I have never been used to planning for a situation that takes too long, so I chose to force these people in the palace treasury to overreact first. Only then can I strike heavily and find an excuse to chase the Xinjiang officials out." Su Wenmao nodded, but he thought that this could not explain his earlier question. Looking at the commissioner's expression, he knew he had a sense of propriety, so he listened patiently. I want to force the enemies in the palace treasury to act, Fan Xian said with a slight smile. Isn't the eldest princess also waiting for me to force her? Given her eyes in the court and palace, how could she not know that the old shopkeepers had followed me to Jiangnan? And she has never told this matter to the officials in the palace. It is clear that she does not want those officials to know my bottom line and not dare to stand out bravely. Think about it. If everyone knew that the old shopkeepers were with us, how could this strike have happened? Naturally, it would not have happened. Su Wenmao furrowed his brows. If they knew that you had old teachers from Qingyu Hall at your side, those treasurers would not have dared to stand out and make irresponsible remarks. But the question is, why would the eldest princess hide this information and wait for the palace treasury officials to secretly make connections, thus giving you a good opportunity to establish her might? If she had explained it clearly beforehand, the treasurers would certainly have been much more well-behaved. Those Xinjiang officials would have also calmed down and not let us find any reason to do so. Fan Xian shook his head and sighed. This eldest princess stands much higher than most people. Yes, it looks like she has given me a chance to establish my might and even allowed me to intimidate a group of officials in the palace treasury. However, in the way I handle this matter, I had no choice but to borrow more of the people and power of the old Yi family. I had to kill people to establish my might. My methods would appear more violent and unscrupulous. He continued to explain, when I first entered the palace treasury, I killed 5 treasurers. If this news got to Jingdo, the court would certainly not have a good evaluation of me. As for using the old shopkeepers to control the palace treasury, it would touch on some people's taboos in the palace. The eldest princess covered this pot of porridge and waited for it to boil. It looked like she wanted me to eat it, but in reality, she wanted to burn my mouth. Su Wenmao worriedly said, "Speaking of which, when you handled the strike that day, your words seemed to touch on some taboos." Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. Su Wenmao's face was full of seriousness. After the strike, killing people, and the old shopkeepers get back to Jingdo, no matter what, the court will reprimand you. At the very least, your actions are reckless and careless, unbearable. He closed his mouth, but Fan Xian smiled and continued, "Unbearable? At the very worst, they could secretly say that I have different aspirations and still remember the Yi family in the past, and so on." Su Wenmao paused and immediately understood what Commissioner Fan feared the most in his life. He involuntarily sucked in a breath of cold air. Only now did he finally feel the eldest princess' methods. She had not done anything. She had only secretly helped Fan Xian hide the news of the old shopkeepers heading south. She had been able to place Fan Xian on the mouth of a very dangerous volcano. Since you understood the plan so well back then, you should have brought out the old shopkeepers at the first opportunity. You should have been more cautious in your actions. He gathered his courage and admonished Fan Xian. Fan Xian shook his head and said, "The eldest princess calculated that I had to intensify the conflict in order to take control of the palace treasury as quickly as possible. As for the aftermath, it is something I cannot care about right now. So, on this point, even if she watches coldly from Jingdo, I still have to do it." He smiled coldly and said, "As for the trusted officials of the palace treasury being dug out by me, because of this, presumably, she also knows that with the help of the Overwatch Council, these people will not be of any use in the next few years. On the contrary, they will bring her unwanted trouble. Since they are already useless people, why would she care about their life or death? They are just a few abandoned chess pieces to give me some trouble before they die. Since no matter what she does, it is impossible to stop my complete takeover. Of course, the eldest princess is willing to see that my takeover will cause some trouble and bring me some hidden worries in the future." The so-called hidden worries in these words were naturally the noble's understanding of Fan Xian. Perhaps there would be some subtle changes because of the palace treasury matter. Who knew if the cold-blooded side Fan Xian showed in handling the palace treasury matter would touch the Empress Dowager's sensitive nerve or make the Empress and the Crown Prince think of the Yi family in the past? Making connections was like a venomous snake that ate at one's heart and soul. Before Fan Xian had enough power to deal with them, perhaps they would become wary. The Empress Dowager, the eldest princess, and the Empress were a group of women in the harem. The Crown Prince and the second prince were a pair of quarrelsome lovers. If they once again united because of Fan Xian's existence, and if the emperor would have some kind of suspicion toward Fan Xian, the eldest princess would laugh. The eldest princess should laugh, and Fan Xian should cry. In the palace treasury matter, the so-called with the shopkeeper in hand, I have the world. The eldest princess had to accept this reality, so she only wanted to obtain some benefits from it. What should I do next? Fan Xian lowered his head and said faintly and insipidly, nothing much. According to the director's words, the eldest princess's vision is still limited to one palace. If the imperial censorate really accuses me this time, I'm afraid she will suffer a loss. Su Wenmao looked at him with disbelief. Fan Xian raised his head and a confident smile rose to his face. Since the emperor has given the old shopkeeper to me, it means that, in a short amount of time, he believes in my loyalty. If I go to Jiangnan to take over the palace treasury, it will damage the eldest princess's face. If the eldest princess maintains her silence at this time, then it's fine. If I do anything wrong in cleaning up the palace treasury, the Jingdo court officials will rise up and attack me. The emperor can't help but be suspicious. As for the problem of the old Yi family, it won't affect me too much. I want this pot of porridge in the palace treasury to be cooked quickly. The eldest princess likes me to use a fierce fire, but I hope she will secretly help me use a fierce fire. Fan Xian smiled and said, although my actions in the palace treasury are impudent and worthy of suspicion, I did not purposely hide it. Naturally, the emperor believes in my sincerity. Although the eldest princess looks on coldly from the side, she is scheming without authorization. This is the so-called insincerity. He finally explained, any scheme, at the final stage, only depends on the emperor's mood and closeness. I have always been completely honest with the emperor. He didn't know if these words were to convince Su Wenmao or to deceive him. In this battle, Fan Xian knew that his son-in-law had to obtain victory. As his son, he also had to obtain victory. After the emperor had established the second prince as an enemy for the crown prince, he had now successfully established Fan Xian as the most valiant whetstone. The eldest princess only saw the pressure Fan Xian's rise brought to the two princes and the Empress Dowager and Empress in the palace. She did not see clearly that this kind of pressure was secretly cultivated by the Qing emperor. This was what Fan Xian had said earlier through Chun Pingping's mouth. The eldest princess's vision was still limited. It was not the limitations of history, but the limitations of her. But, after all, she was not an emperor who sat on the dragon chair and looked down on the world. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.